Hi guys, tonight, unmasking Victorian womanhood. The Victorian age, spanning Queen Victoria's long, influential reign, presented itself to the world as an epoch of unparalleled stability, moral seriousness, and progress. It was the age of steam, of vast industrial wealth, and a strict, unyielding social hierarchy. Yet, behind the lace curtains and the meticulously maintained gardens of the middle and upper classes, this era harbored a deep, systemic anxiety regarding the status and function of women. The image projected, one of serene domestic perfection, was a societal construct, a beautiful velvet glove designed to conceal the iron hand of control that dictated every aspect of a woman's existence, from her posture to her prognosis. To an American audience, accustomed to narratives of frontier spirit and self-reliance, the constraints placed upon the Victorian woman often seemed medieval. She was not a citizen in the modern sense, but a dependent. Her identity was fundamentally tied to her relationship with a man, first as a daughter, then as a wife. The core of her psychological and physical destruction lay in a set of rigid, culturally mandated obsessions that were celebrated as virtues, but operated as literal and metaphorical chains. The tyranny of the separate spheres and the angel in the house. The foundation of this destructive system was the doctrine of separate spheres. The world was bifurcated. The public sphere, work, commerce, politics, intellect, was the realm of men, described as rough, competitive, and even morally dangerous. The private sphere, the home, family, morality, piety, was the exclusive sanctuary of women. This ideology elevated the woman to the status of the angel in the house, a term popularized by Coventry Patmore's lengthy poem. This angel was a creature of absolute purity, self-sacrificing, nurturing, and submissive. Her worth was not measured by her achievements, but by her moral inertia, her success in remaining untainted by the outside world. This created a paradox. The woman was morally superior, yet legally and economically inferior. The home was her kingdom, yet she ruled it with borrowed authority, ultimately serving as an unpaid manager of her husband's domestic comfort. The iron hand here was insidious. By isolating her in this sanctuary, society denied her access to the tools of real power, education in law, finance, and meaningful professional work. She was given the moral high ground, but had no agency to act upon it. Her emotional and intellectual frustrations were pathologized, leading directly into the first major physical obsession: the fatal curve. The corset. The corset was the most visible, tangible manifestation of the iron hand. It was not merely a fashion accessory, it was a societal brace that physically enforced the ideal of female fragility and containment. The demand for the hourglass figure, the smaller the waist, the higher the status, led to the practice of tight lacing. This obsession with the fatal curve was literally body-destroying. Whalebone or steel stays were pulled so tight, often by a maid or a lacing mechanism, that the waist could be reduced by 4 to 6 inches. Medical professionals of the time frequently warned of the consequences, which ranged from the immediately uncomfortable to the terminally dangerous. Internal organ damage. Tight lacing exerted continuous, unnatural pressure on the abdominal organs. The liver, stomach, and intestines were displaced or compressed, leading to chronic indigestion, constipation, and difficulty in pregnancy. Skeletal deformity. With consistent long-term use from a young age, the corset permanently altered the skeletal structure. Rib cages were bent inward and upward, resulting in misshapen lungs and restricted diaphragmic movement. Examinations of Victorian skeletons confirm this severe rib distortion and spinal misalignment. Respiratory restriction and hysteria. The reduced lung capacity caused perpetual shallow breathing. This restriction led directly to frequent fainting spells, which, far from being signs of weakness, became a perverse badge of honor. proof that a woman was too delicate for the harsh realities of the world. Doctors would often link these respiratory symptoms to hysteria, thereby blaming the woman's femininity for symptoms directly caused by her required clothing. The act of tight lacing was a daily ritual of self-confinement, turning the female body into an obedient, sculpted artifact. To loosen the corset was to risk social censure. To wear it was to accept the daily price of chronic physical discomfort and limited movement. The arsenic glow. Complexion. If the corset controlled the shape of the woman's body, the obsession with a pale, ethereal complexion controlled its surface. In Victorian society, skin color was a clear marker of class and lifestyle. A tan indicated labor in the sun, work for the lower classes. Therefore, an aristocratic or middle-class lady had to maintain a deathly pallor, a translucent white that signaled she lived a purely indoor leisured existence. This pursuit of whiteness led to one of the most terrifying obsessions, the use of highly toxic, lethal chemicals in cosmetics. The arsenic glow was not an exaggeration, it was a literal, dangerous trend. Arsenic wafers. Women consumed small amounts of arsenic wafers, believing the poison would clear the skin, whiten the complexion, and brighten the eyes. The arsenic achieved the desired pallor by killing red blood cells, which indeed made the skin look paler, but at the cost of chronic poisoning. The effects included digestive issues, hair loss, and eventual organ failure. Lead-based face paints. White lead was a common ingredient in face powders and paints. While providing excellent coverage and brightness, the lead was absorbed through the skin, causing lead poisoning, resulting in paralysis, insanity, and disfiguring skin conditions that women then had to conceal with more poison. The belladonna eye. To achieve large, glistening pupils, a look deemed alluringly fragile, women dropped belladonna, deadly nightshade solution, into their eyes. While it dilated the pupils, it also caused blurred vision, light sensitivity, and with consistent use, potential blindness. The obsession with complexion was a morbid commitment to vanity as a virtue. A woman was expected to look beautiful and delicate at all times, even as the act of achieving that look was systematically poisoning her from the inside out. Her appearance was a display of her husband's success, making the maintenance of the arsenic glow a duty, not a choice. Widow's weeds and perpetual grief. Mourning rituals. Following the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria retreated into a dramatic public display of lifelong mourning. This set a precedent that became a rigid social code, particularly for women. The obsession with mourning rituals. This obsession was a profound social and economic burden, especially for widows. A widow was forced to enter an elaborate, multi-stage ritual that could last up to 2.5 years, enforced by clothing known as widow's weeds. This was another form of confinement, where the iron hand became a cloak of oppressive fabric. Deep mourning, 1 year and 1 day. The woman had to wear clothes made exclusively of deep black, dull, lusterless fabrics, primarily crepe, a coarse, expensive silk fabric. Crepe absorbed light and moisture, becoming scratchy and heavy. This fabric, deliberately uncomfortable, ensured the wearer was perpetually reminded of her grief and literally felt the burden of her loss. All jewelry, save for black jet or hair jewelry, made from the deceased's hair, was forbidden. Economic ruin. The cost of an entire wardrobe change, down to gloves, stationery, and fans, all of which had to be black, was enormous. For a woman suddenly deprived of her husband's income, this expense could be financially ruinous, forcing her into debt to maintain the social performance of grief. Social isolation. The heavy black veils and restrictive clothing signified her unavailability and seclusion. She was effectively isolated from society, making it difficult to find work or remarry. To shorten the period of mourning or wear anything remotely cheerful was considered an act of disrespect and moral failure. The unending performance of loss was a way for society to control female emotion. A man's mourning was simple, a black armband for a few months. A woman's was a visible, suffocating sentence, ensuring that even in grief, her life was utterly governed by rigid rules of appearance. The cult of the invalid, sickness. If a woman could not perfectly adhere to the suffocating standards of the angel in the house, the final acceptable avenue for female expression and power was to assume the role of the invalid. The cult of the invalid was a uniquely Victorian phenomenon, where physical frailty and chronic illness became a desired social currency, particularly among the wealthy. Being too delicate to engage in demanding social duties or domestic chores granted a woman a form of psychological leverage otherwise unavailable to her. Power through passivity. The invalid woman was, paradoxically, the center of the household's attention. She could command the flow of visitors, excuse herself from unwanted commitments, and demand the care and attention of her family. Sickness became a weapon against the rigid structures that confined her. The diagnosis of discontent. When a woman expressed frustration, boredom, or intellectual desire, symptoms of being stifled, male doctors were quick to diagnose her with hysteria or nerves. These diagnoses validated the idea that female brains were too fragile for serious thought, protecting the system from having to admit that the system itself was the source of the illness. The imprisonment of the rest cure. For those deemed most afflicted, the Iron Hand prescribed the rest cure, developed by Dr. S. Weir Mitchell. This treatment was, in essence, an isolation sentence. The patient was confined to bed for weeks or months, forbidden to read, write, or even feed herself. She was force-fed a high-fat diet and subjected to massage and electric treatment. The goal was not physical healing, but the psychological enforcement of passive obedience to physically break the rebellious spirit of a woman who rejected her prescribed role. The cult of the invalid served as the ultimate paradox. Women who were destroyed by society's obsessions found a perverse kind of status and control by embracing the destruction. They exchanged real life for a life of enforced weakness, becoming a fixture on the drawing room sofa, a prisoner in the velvet glove, secured by the brutal iron hand of Victorian expectation. The cumulative effect of these initial four obsessions, the corset, the arsenic, the crepe, and the sickbed, was the creation of a fragile, dependent, and systematically damaged woman, preparing the ground for the deeper emotional and societal chains to be explored next. Tight lacing and the collapse of the rib cage. Following the initial insidious constraints of the angel in the house ideal, the first material instrument of the Victorian woman's destruction was the corset. It was not merely a garment. It was a societal mandate, a structural embodiment of the iron hand hidden beneath the era's velvet glove. The pursuit of the fatal curve, the unnaturally small, often impossible hourglass waist, turned fashion into a form of continuous self-mutilation and confinement, literally reshaping and collapsing the female ribcage and organs to fit a man's aesthetic fantasy. The historical mandate, from stays to steely cages. The concept of corsetry was not new to the Victorian age, but the intensity and rigidity of the garment reached their zenith during this period. Earlier stays were often softer, designed primarily to lift the bust and smooth the lines of the bodice. However, the Victorian corset, particularly from the 1840s onwards, became a sophisticated, often brutal instrument of architectural control. The ideal figure shifted away from the softer lines of the Regency era toward an extreme hourglass shape known as the wasp waist. This required an apparatus far sturdier than mere fabric. The construction of the Victorian corset was a testament to both ingenious engineering and willful cruelty. Materials. It was built from layers of heavy cotton twill or satin, reinforced by rows of rigid cording and strategically placed busks, often made of steel, running down the center front. The bones. The flexibility of whalebone was preferred in the early period, but as the obsession with a smaller waist intensified, the use of steel boning became common. These unforgiving steel rods were inserted into dozens of channels, turning the soft tissue of the torso into a cage. The lacing. The back of the garment featured an intricate system of grommets and robust laces, usually made of braided cotton or silk. Crucially, the woman was rarely expected to lace herself. The task required a maid, a family member, or, terrifyingly, a specialized lacing machine, emphasizing that this was a process of being acted upon, not self-styling. The corset transformed the female body from a living, flexible organism into an architectural structure. The act of wearing it was a daily, painful declaration of her adherence to a system that valued artificial form over natural function. The vow of contained fragility. The practice of tight lacing was the extreme endpoint of this obsession. This involved systematically cinching the waist to a circumference that was often medically dangerous, sometimes as small as 18 or even 16 inches. The resulting silhouette, known as the fatal curve, was socially triumphant but physically devastating. The motivation behind this extreme compression was deeply intertwined with the themes of purity and class. 1. Class distinction. A tiny waist was irrefutable evidence of a life of leisure. A working woman needed her lungs and muscle strength for labor. A woman with a wasp waist was visibly incapable of any meaningful physical exertion, marking her as part of the elite whose time was spent solely on social and domestic duties. 2. Sexual control. The corset functioned as a powerful symbol of containment. It visually divided the woman's body into a tiny, controlled waist, emphasizing a high, modest bust and wide, fertile hips. The crushing compression was a symbolic enforcement of her emotional and sexual passivity. She was literally bound and controlled. 3. The fainting status symbol. The inevitable result of restricted breathing was lightheadedness and fainting. As discussed, the act of fainting in public became perversely a status symbol. It demonstrated that the woman was too sensitive, too delicate, and too confined to survive the normal rush of life, a perfect embodiment of the frail angel in the house ideal. For young girls, the lacing began early. At the onset of adolescence, girls were often put into progressively smaller corsets, a painful rite of passage that taught them from their earliest years that their body was a thing to be controlled, concealed, and fundamentally mistrusted. The collapse of the rib cage and organ displacement. Despite the cultural adoration, the medical community was widely aware of the horrifying consequences of tight lacing, though their warnings were frequently dismissed in favor of fashion. The effects were not merely uncomfortable, they were chronic, debilitating, and often fatal. The most dramatic physical consequence was the collapse of the rib cage. Human ribs are designed to move and expand during respiration. Constant pressure from steel and whalebone forced the lower ribs inward and upward, permanently altering their shape. Respiratory failure. The compressed ribs and diaphragm severely restricted lung capacity. Women could only breathe shallowly from the top of the lungs, leading to chronic shortness of breath, fatigue, and an inability to perform even moderate physical activity. Pneumonia and tuberculosis, already scourges of the era, were often fatal in women whose respiratory systems were permanently compromised by corsetry. Organ dislocation. The internal organs were forced down and out of their natural positions. The stomach was constricted, leading to severe indigestion, chronic heartburn, and a perpetual inability to eat full meals, a perverse benefit for those seeking to maintain their slim figure. The liver was often deeply indented and even bifurcated or split by the pressure of the ribs, a condition recorded in autopsy reports of the time. Damage to the reproductive system. The downward pressure exerted by the corset forced the pelvic organs, the uterus, ovaries, and bladder, out of alignment. This pressure contributed to common and painful Victorian female ailments, including uterine prolapse and chronic urinary tract issues. For pregnant women who continued to lace, the risk of miscarriage or fatal complications during childbirth was significantly increased. Muscular atrophy and spinal damage. The corset acted as an external skeleton, preventing the wearer's core muscles from engaging. Over time, these muscles withered away or atrophied, making it impossible for the woman to hold her own torso upright without the garment. This dependency ensured that the corset became a lifelong necessity, chaining her to the contraption long after she might have desired freedom. The iron hand was thus proven to be a literal instrument of torture, turning the woman's body into a permanent construction site of self-inflicted injuries in the name of respectability. The psychology of the wasp waist. The endurance of the corset cannot be explained by fashion alone. It was deeply rooted in the psychology of female compliance and submission. Tight lacing was a form of psychological conditioning, an everyday reinforcement of external control. Pain as virtue. The daily pain was normalized. To endure the discomfort without complaint was a demonstration of self-control, patience, and feminine discipline, all cardinal Victorian virtues. The pain became a silent form of suffering that was celebrated, not pitied. The sense of propriety. For many women, the corset became indispensable not just physically, but psychologically. It provided a sense of being together, of being socially acceptable. Without the structure, many felt undone, loose, or morally exposed, even though the garment was their torturer. This internalized self-policing was the Iron Hand's greatest victory. The narrative of necessity. The popular narrative argued that the female body was inherently weak, unstable, and required external support to function correctly. This was a classic societal gaslighting technique, creating a debilitating condition, muscle atrophy and organ damage, and then presenting the cause of the problem, the corset, as the necessary cure. The fatal curve was a visible sign of the woman who had accepted her limitations, her fragility, her lack of agency, and her containment, making it one of the most effective and destructive obsessions of the age. It was a prison she wore, a constant reminder of the society's demand for the unrealistically small, passive female form. The unlacing at night was a brief, painful reprieve. The lacing at dawn was the resumption of her sentence. The legacy of the fatal curve. While the extremes of tight lacing eventually faded with the dawning of the 20th century, the legacy of the fatal curve persists. It established the cultural framework that female beauty requires pain, discomfort, and the suppression of natural physical function. It cemented the idea that the female body is a canvas for external reshaping, rather than a vessel for power and activity. The steel busk may be gone, but the obsession remains, an obsession with controlling weight, restricting diet, and accepting surgical alteration in the pursuit of an ideal that prioritizes aesthetic compliance over health and functionality. The Victorian corset, with its tragic legacy of collapsed rib cages and compressed organs, stands as a stark historical monument to the price exacted by the iron hand in the velvet glove. Beauty at any cost, and the death of the skin. If the corset was the external cage, then the obsession with achieving an ethereal, deathly pale complexion was the invisible internal poison. In Victorian society, the ideal woman was not merely contained, she had to appear translucent, almost bloodless, a visual testament to her elevated social status. The pursuit of this ideal, known as the arsenic glow, led countless women to embrace beauty regimens that utilized some of the deadliest toxins known to man, effectively turning their pursuit of vanity into a long, agonizing chemical suicide.
Whiteness as a weapon of class. The obsession with whiteness was fundamentally rooted in the rigid Victorian class structure. In a society industrialized and powered by manual labor, a woman's complexion was the ultimate advertisement of her economic standing. The mark of leisure. A tanned or ruddy complexion signaled that a woman worked outdoors, in the fields, markets, or cottage industries, a clear marker of the lower classes. Therefore, a lady of the middle or upper class was required to maintain a profound pallor, an absence of color that declared her hands were never soiled by labor and her skin was never touched by the sun. She was a perpetual indoor creature, sheltered from the grime and harshness of the public sphere. The symbol of purity. Whiteness was inextricably linked to the core Victorian obsession of purity. A pale face suggested a body untouched by base passions or the vulgarity of the material world. It was the visual aesthetic of the angel in the house, a creature too delicate for life's harsh realities. The look of frailty. This aesthetic tied directly back to the cult of the invalid. A pale face suggested consumption, tuberculosis, a disease often romanticized in the Victorian era. The appearance of being perpetually delicate and prone to collapse was desirable, and women consciously sought this fragile, almost ghostly look to confirm their sensitive, feminine nature. This social pressure created a desperate market for products that promised to deliver this artificial, bloodless beauty, leading women directly into the arms of poison. Poison in the dressing room. The Victorian woman's dressing table was a laboratory of lethal chemicals. Unregulated cosmetic markets allowed manufacturers to package and sell powerful toxins with impunity, often advertising them with misleadingly benevolent names. The most direct and devastating method was the ingestion of arsenic wafers, or liquid solutions containing arsenic trioxide, known as Fowler's solution. Arsenic was paradoxically highly sought after for cosmetic purposes, particularly in Styria, Austria, where women known as arsenic eaters were famed for their clear, seemingly radiant skin.
The false promise. Women believed that consuming small measured doses of arsenic would clear the skin, whiten the complexion by suppressing red blood cells, and give the eyes a characteristic bright, glistening quality, the fabled arsenic glow. The fatal mechanism. Arsenic is a cumulative poison. While small doses might initially produce the desired effects, it systematically damaged the body. It destroyed the lining of the stomach and intestines, caused nerve damage, neuropathy, and led to painful, debilitating stomach cramps. Furthermore, the ingestion caused a severe form of hair loss, forcing women to adopt increasingly elaborate wigs and head coverings. The addiction. Crucially, once a woman began consuming arsenic, her body developed a morbid dependency. Stopping the practice abruptly led to agonizing withdrawal symptoms. To maintain the pale complexion and avoid severe sickness, the woman was forced to continue increasing her dosage, leading inexorably toward chronic poisoning, organ failure, and a slow, painful death. The pursuit of beauty mandated a tragic addiction to poison. If arsenic worked from the inside, lead-based cosmetics worked from the outside with equally catastrophic results. White lead, or cerus. The preferred compound for face paint was cerus, a thick white paste made of lead carbonate. It offered exceptional coverage, hiding blemishes, redness, and any trace of natural coloring. It gave the skin an unnaturally smooth, matte finish that was highly prized. Absorption and death. The lead in the cerus was readily absorbed through the skin, especially when applied heavily and worn for long periods. Lead poisoning caused a horrifying array of symptoms: painter's colic, severe abdominal pain, chronic constipation, and muscle wasting. In extreme cases, it led to lead palsy, a form of paralysis often affecting the hands or wrist drop, and severe neurological damage leading to insanity and delirium. The very makeup meant to make a woman alluring was slowly driving her mad. Disfigurement. Ironically, long-term use of lead makeup caused the skin underneath to blacken, pucker, and erode. Women would then apply thicker layers of lead paste to conceal the disfigurement caused by the lead itself, creating a vicious cycle of toxicity and reliance. To complete the ethereal look, women sought to brighten their eyes, making them appear large, wide, and strangely luminous. Deadly nightshade. They achieved this by applying drops of belladonna solution, derived from Atropa belladonna, or deadly nightshade. This potent plant chemical is a powerful dilator. The cost of allure. The belladonna drops dramatically dilated the pupils, giving the eyes a dark, deep, and glittering appearance. However, the drops caused severe sensitivity to light, blurred vision, and constant irritation. Consistent use could lead to retinal damage and was a clear path to vision impairment or even permanent blindness. The woman literally traded her ability to see the world clearly for the sake of conforming to the aesthetic ideal. The medical and psychological catastrophe. The tragedy of the arsenic glow lies not just in the individual deaths, but in the collective medical and psychological toll exacted by this obsession. Victorian doctors, often ill-equipped to understand the slow, cumulative effects of these toxins, frequently misdiagnosed the symptoms of poisoning. Gastrointestinal distress. The nausea, severe vomiting, and abdominal pain caused by arsenic and lead were often attributed to generic female complaints, or worse, linked back to the ever-present diagnosis of hysteria. The woman's internal suffering was dismissed as a sign of her inherent female weakness, masking the true deadly cause. Neurological breakdown. Lead palsy, tremors, and the neurological episodes resulting from heavy metal toxicity were rarely attributed to the cosmetics. Instead, these neurological breakdowns became further proof that the woman's fragile nerves had failed. justifying the cruel and isolating rest cure that only delayed the discovery of the true toxic culprit. The woman trapped in the arsenic cycle was caught in a deep psychological trap. Denial. She could not admit that her treasured beauty products were killing her, as that would invalidate the immense sacrifice, pain, expense, and secrecy she had already made. Secrecy. The use of arsenic and lead was often performed in secret. This required a profound sense of isolation and deceit, eroding her mental well-being and preventing any intervention from family or friends. Escalation. As the poisons caused increasing damage, discoloring the skin, causing hair loss, the need for more cosmetic coverage became desperate. She was forced to apply thicker layers of cerus or increase the dosage of arsenic to conceal the visible marks of the toxins themselves, accelerating the process of her destruction. The aesthetic of the corpse. Ultimately, the Victorian woman's obsession with a pale complexion was a morbid fascination with the aesthetic of the corpse. The ideal look, still, pale, waxen, and untouched by life, was closer to death than to health. This aesthetic reached its horrifying peak with the post-mortem photography trend of the era. Relatives would often pose their deceased loved ones, often children, as if they were still alive, using props to suggest sleep. The pale, smooth, doll-like faces captured in these photographs were disturbingly similar to the living ideal women were striving for. The beauty ideal was, in essence, the look of the beautifully dead. By embracing the arsenic glow, the Victorian woman was not just pursuing beauty, she was enacting a form of slow, cultural self-annihilation, validating the societal narrative that her body was merely an object for display, even if that display required her to sacrifice her health, her sight, and ultimately her life. The cosmetic industry, driven by the iron hand of societal demand, capitalized on this desperation, turning the most intimate space, the dressing room, into a place of mortal peril.
The unending performance of loss. The Victorian era, with its high mortality rates and profound religious conviction, was obsessed with death. Yet, for women, death was not merely an inevitability, it was a script. The moment a woman's husband died, she was immediately enveloped by the fourth, most visible constraint of the iron hand, the rigid, non-negotiable code of mourning rituals. This obsession demanded an unending performance of loss, primarily through the oppressive, heavy symbolism of her clothing, known as widow's weeds. This societal pressure transformed sincere grief into a prolonged, expensive, and psychologically devastating public spectacle, effectively turning the woman's body into a walking monument to her husband's absence and her own total confinement. The royal precedent and the social mandate. The architecture of Victorian mourning was built upon a single powerful precedent: Queen Victoria herself. Following the sudden death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, in 1861, the Queen retreated into a state of public, profound, and lifelong grief. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life, establishing a national mood that elevated mourning from a private necessity to a paramount social duty. For every woman, particularly those of the middle and upper classes, adhering to the mourning codes became a stringent measure of her respectability, piety, and devotion. To ignore the rules was not merely poor taste, it was a profound moral failure that invited immediate social censure. The underlying purpose of this mandate was clear: to control female sexuality and independence following the death of her male protector. The widow's weeds served as a visible signpost. This woman is contained, she is grieving, and she is emphatically not available. This prevented her from swiftly remarrying or, worse, enjoying her newfound freedom, thus maintaining the strict social order dependent on male headship. The three-stage prison of crepe. The ritual of mourning was divided into strict,
time-bound phases, each demanding specific garments, materials, and behaviors. The entire process, lasting a minimum of 2 years, was structured to make the woman's return to the world as slow and difficult as possible. This was the period of absolute, non-negotiable blackness and isolation. The crepe curtain. The defining feature was the overwhelming use of crepe, a specific type of stiffened silk fabric with a dull, crinkled finish. Crepe was chosen because it absorbed light, producing a flat, lifeless black, and crucially, it was uncomfortable. It was heavy, scratchy, and ruined by rain or moisture. The sheer volume of crepe required, covering dresses, bonnets, cloaks, and veils, made the clothes physically oppressive. The woman was literally weighed down by her grief. The veil. The most powerful symbol was the huge, black crepe veil that covered the face. This veil served multiple functions. It concealed her face from public view, rendering her socially invisible. It restricted her vision, limiting her ability to interact with the world, and it often made breathing difficult, a physical manifestation of her stifled existence. Isolation. During deep mourning, the widow was largely confined to her home. She could not attend social events, theaters, or balls. Any contact with the outside world was restricted to church and quiet, formal calls. Her life was defined by seclusion and silence. This phase offered a minimal, almost cruelly slow relaxation of the rules. Lusterless fabrics. The widow could begin to wear black fabrics that had a slight sheen, like silk or cashmere, but the silhouette remained strictly severe. The vast amount of heavy, scratchy crepe was reduced, but not entirely eliminated. The veil receded. The face veil was shortened, allowing her to lift it and interact more directly, yet it remained a symbol draped over the bonnet, ready to be dropped into place as a sign of respect or piety. This was the slow transition back to color, marking her hesitant return to society. Limited color. The woman was permitted to introduce small accents of white, gray, or mauve, a color often associated with fading sorrow. A white collar or cuffs provided the only break from the somber palette. Jewelry could finally be worn, but it was restricted to stark black materials like jet, fossilized wood, or, most morbidly, hair jewelry, which contained locks of the deceased's hair, forcing the widow to literally wear a piece of her dead husband. The entire timetable, enforced by social observers and women's magazines, ensured that for a minimum of 2 years, the widow's appearance was governed by her loss, not her desire. The economic and social ruin. While the mourning ritual was culturally imperative, it was an enormous financial catastrophe for many widows, acting as a profound economic tool of control. The cost of conformity. Mourning clothing was exceptionally expensive. Crepe was costly, and a woman needed an entirely new, extensive wardrobe, including multiple dresses, bonnets, cloaks, gloves, undergarments, and accessories, all in specific fabrics and cuts. For a woman suddenly deprived of her husband's income, this expense often forced her to sell assets, deplete savings, or go into substantial debt simply to comply with social demands. Employment barriers. The black attire served as an aggressive barrier to re-entry into the workforce. A woman in full crepe could not be seen in a lively shop or any environment demanding cheerfulness. Even if she sought respectable work as a governess or a companion, her attire advertised her recent tragedy, marking her as emotionally fragile and possibly economically desperate, qualities that made employers wary of her. The widow's dependence. The economic cost and social isolation ensured that the widow remained dependent, often forcing her to rely on the charity or control of male relatives, her deceased husband's brothers or her own father, thereby passing the iron hand from one male authority to another. True financial independence was virtually impossible while shrouded in the expensive, restrictive fabric of grief. the psychological weight of perpetual performance. The psychological impact of the widow's weeds was perhaps the most enduring and cruel consequence of this obsession. Sincere grief was stifled by the requirement for continuous, visible performance. Stifled grief. The elaborate ritual left no room for genuine, messy grief. The widow was expected to maintain a posture of dignified sorrow. Any lapse into actual despair, anger, or, God forbid, relief was seen as improper. The pressure to perform was so great that genuine processing of loss was delayed or denied. Sensory deprivation. The heavy, scratchy crepe, the restrictive veils, and the dark confinement contributed to a pervasive sense of sensory deprivation. The world was literally duller, darker, and rougher to the touch, reinforcing the feeling that her life, like her clothes, had lost all color and vitality. Internalized obsession. Many women internalized the societal expectation, making the grief perpetual. To cease mourning was to admit that life could continue without the man, an act that felt like betrayal. The performance ceased to be a duty and became a self-imposed prison, where the woman's only remaining identity was her status as a bereaved, submissive wife. Writers and psychologists of the time noted that many women, after the obligatory period was over, were psychologically unable to shed the black. They had worn the performance for so long that they no longer knew who they were without the role of the grieving widow. The morbid aesthetics and hair jewelry. The obsession extended into the very nature of mementos, creating a morbid aesthetic that kept the woman tethered to the dead. Postmortem photography. As a grim extension of the mourning ritual, widows often commissioned postmortem photographs of their deceased husbands or children. This practice, while stemming from genuine love, normalized the presence of the dead in the domestic sphere, further anchoring the woman in her state of perpetual loss. Hair jewelry. Perhaps the most disturbing of the mourning customs was the popularity of hair jewelry. This jewelry was created by weaving, braiding, or setting the hair of the deceased into brooches, necklaces, or rings. A widow might wear a ring containing her husband's hair, placing the physical material of the dead man literally upon her body. This extreme fetishization of the deceased ensured that the widow's closest accessories were morbid reminders, physically sealing her commitment to the performance of grief.
The resistance and eventual decline. Towards the end of the Victorian period, as women began to gain more financial and educational independence, resistance to the suffocating mourning codes began to grow. The rational dress movement. Reformers began to argue that the heavy, restrictive crepe and the sheer volume of black fabric were unhygienic, unhealthful, and economically wasteful. They advocated for simpler, less expensive, and shorter mourning periods. Shifting social values. As new middle-class women entered the professions, the practicalities of work clashed sharply with the demands of widow's weeds. A lawyer or doctor could not effectively serve her clients while shrouded in a restrictive black veil and heavy crepe. The need for economic survival slowly began to override the demands of social conformity. The unending performance of loss stands as one of the most powerful examples of how Victorian society used rituals and aesthetics to control female economic power, suppress individuality, and perpetuate dependence. The crepe dress was more than just fabric. It was a heavy, suffocating shroud of societal expectation, designed to bury the living woman along with her dead husband. How frailty became a desired social currency. Having been physically reshaped by the corset, poisoned by cosmetics, and shrouded by mourning attire, the Victorian woman found herself left with one final perverse obsession as an acceptable means of escape and control: the cult of the invalid. In a society where health meant capability and capability meant independence, traits strictly forbidden to the upper and middle class woman, chronic, delicate illness became a powerful, albeit self-destructive, form of social currency. Frailty was no longer a misfortune. It was a desirable social condition, a visible badge of a woman's sensitivity, purity, and freedom from the vulgar strain of labor. The iron hand, having failed to break every woman, offered the sickbed as a velvet-lined prison where she could exert a measure of control denied to her in health. The ideological roots of female frailty. The idealization of sickness was built upon core Victorian medical and philosophical beliefs that explicitly linked female weakness to moral superiority. The delicate constitution. Victorian medicine, dominated by male practitioners, promoted the idea that the female body, particularly the reproductive system, was inherently fragile and prone to breakdown under stress. The womb, far from being a source of strength, was believed to be the central organ governing all female emotion and health, an idea reinforced by the ancient Greek concept of hysteria, meaning of the womb. The intellectual threat. Any demonstration of intellectual vigor, ambition, or passion by a woman was seen as a direct threat to her reproductive health. Doctors warned that energy spent on reading, studying, or intellectual discourse would drain the nervous energy required by the ovaries and uterus, leading to sterility or insanity. A woman's brain was deemed a rival to her womb. The symbol of leisure. Similar to the pale skin and the wasp waist, the sickbed was a clear declaration of leisure. A woman too ill to leave her sofa or travel was visibly incapable of work, certifying her husband's wealth and her family's secure status. The illness was the final, irrefutable proof of her separation from the working class. Thus, falling ill was not a failing, it was a way of conforming perfectly to the most rigid requirements of Victorian femininity. The diagnosis of discontent. The central pillar of the cult of the invalid was the all-encompassing diagnosis of hysteria. By the late 19th century, hysteria was not a single disease, but a sweeping, catch-all term used to explain any female emotional distress, intellectual curiosity, sexual frustration, or refusal to conform to the angel in the house role. The symptoms of hysteria were vast and often contradictory, including fainting, anxiety, nervousness, depression, insomnia, temporary paralysis, and even morbid cravings or overexcitement. In reality, these were often the genuine psychological manifestations of extreme cultural suppression, boredom, frustration, and a profound lack of purpose. The doctor as controller. The diagnosis of hysteria was in effect a medical invalidation of the woman's true feelings. By labeling her distress as a disorder rooted in her unstable female organs, the male medical establishment effectively silenced any legitimate complaints about her confinement or lack of control. The iron hand wielded the stethoscope. The psychological power of the name. For the woman herself, receiving a diagnosis provided a strange form of validation. It offered a socially acceptable language to express her internal conflict. She couldn't say, "I am bored and trapped," but she could say, "My nerves are failing," and be met with sympathy and attention rather than criticism. Imprisonment by prescription. For women diagnosed with severe neurasthenia or hysteria, often those who showed the strongest resistance to the traditional domestic role, the iron hand provided its harshest prescription, the rest cure. Developed by the American physician Dr. S. Weir Mitchell, the rest cure was a treatment that was, in reality, a disciplinary action designed to enforce submission and physical passivity. Total isolation. The patient was removed from her home and placed in a secluded setting, often under the care of a strict nurse. She was cut off from all family, friends, and stimulating company. This was designed to eliminate the very sources of external support that might encourage her independence. Forced inactivity. The woman was confined to bed for weeks or even months. Crucially, she was forbidden to engage in any mentally stimulating activity. No reading, no writing, no sewing, and often no talking. This was a deliberate attempt to starve her mind and break her intellect, forcing her to focus solely on her body's functions. Her control over her basic functions, eating, moving, speaking, was absolute.
the social and domestic dynamics of the invalid. In the domestic sphere, assuming the role of the invalid offered the Victorian woman a precious form of control and significance that was otherwise impossible to attain. The center of attention. The woman on the sofa became the focus of the household's energy. Family life revolved around her schedule, her needs, and her delicate condition. This attention, denied to her as a healthy, quietly obedient wife, became her source of validation. Her illness, in a strange way, made her matter. The escape clause. Sickness became a legitimate excuse to avoid the overwhelming, monotonous demands of domestic life. She could, with full social sanction, excuse herself from tiresome social calls, the meticulous management of servants, and the incessant sewing required for the family's wardrobe. The disease granted her an acceptable professional leave from her domestic duties. Wielding guilt as power. Her frailty became a powerful tool of emotional manipulation. Her husband and children were forced to treat her with deference and care, perpetually haunted by the fear of causing a relapse or nervous episode. She gained power not through authority, but through vulnerability, leveraging the guilt and fear of her family to enforce compliance. This was the irony of the cult. By accepting the most severe limitation, physical illness, she purchased the only measure of power available to her. She destroyed her body to save her sanity and secure her domestic importance.
The romanticization of consumption. No disease was more emblematic of the cult of the invalid than consumption, tuberculosis, or TB. Unlike the psychological ambiguity of hysteria, consumption was a real deadly plague, yet it became morbidly romanticized in the Victorian imagination. The aesthetic of consumption. The early stages of TB produced a beautiful pallor, the arsenic glow achieved naturally, bright, feverish eyes, similar to the belladonna eye, and often a slender, delicate figure. The image of the consumptive patient, a person of heightened sensitivity, profound thoughts, and ethereal beauty, was a perfect fit for the idealized, delicate woman. The tragic heroine. Literary figures, such as those in the works of Charles Dickens or Alexander Dumas, often portrayed consumptive women as tragic heroines whose fragility made them more pure and spiritual. This reinforced the idea that physical decline was linked to spiritual elevation. A respectable death. Consumption was seen as a clean, elegant way to die, often contrasted with the messy, undignified deaths caused by industrial accidents or contagious fevers. It allowed the woman to exit the stage of life conforming perfectly to the aesthetic ideal, a beautifully suffering, pure soul leaving the vile world behind. Thus, the disease itself became a perverse object of aspiration, a final fatal path to social acceptance and literary glory. The legacy of the invalid. The Victorian cult of the invalid was a profound cultural defense mechanism. It was a means for society to contain the immense pressure and frustration of its women without having to reform its rigid patriarchal structures. By defining female discontent as medical illness, it ensured that the victim was always blamed and the system was always excused. The final destruction enacted by the Iron Hand was the woman's self-betrayal, her willing acceptance of weakness and illness as her only currency. When the 20th century finally offered real avenues for female education and work, the shadow of the invalid lingered. Generations of women had to unlearn the belief that frailty was beauty and that suffering was a mark of virtue. The slow, painful reclamation of the active, robust, and healthy female body remains one of the greatest challenges inherited from the gilded cage of the Victorian age. The needle and the nightmare. Sewing, silence, and the boredom of the drawing room. If Part 1 dealt with the physical restraints of the Victorian woman, the corset, the poison, the mourning veil, and the sickbed, Part 2 shifts to the invisible, psychological shackles. The transition from physical constraint to emotional confinement is perfectly embodied in the obsessive demand for needlework.
This seemingly innocuous domestic activity, celebrated as a feminine virtue, was in reality a powerful tool of the iron hand, used to enforce silence, restrict intellectual engagement, and conceal the paralyzing boredom of the drawing room. The ideology of industrious inactivity. The core paradox of the Victorian lady was the demand for industrious inactivity. She was expected to be constantly busy, demonstrating her worth through continuous labor, but that labor had to be domestically contained and must not, under any circumstances, generate wealth. The fear of idleness. In the Victorian moral framework, idleness was the devil's playground. It was believed that an idle mind, especially a female mind, prone to nervous excitation, would naturally wander toward dangerous intellectual thoughts, ambition, or sexual fancy. The needle was the prescribed antidote, a tireless, repetitive task that occupied the hands and eyes, leaving the mind just engaged enough to prevent dangerous introspection, but not enough to permit serious study. The cult of domestic perfection. The home was the woman's moral realm, and the fabrics within it were her responsibility. A middle or upper-class woman was expected to manage the vast amount of sewing required for the family, repairing, mending, altering clothes for the ever-growing children, and creating household items like linens, curtains, and cushions. While the very wealthy employed seamstresses, the lady of the house still had to oversee and perform some work to demonstrate her moral fitness. Needlework as proof of purity. Elaborate needlework, embroidery, lacework, and intricate cross-stitching was a display of patience, submission, and feminine virtue. A woman's delicate, precise stitching demonstrated her inherent refinement and her adherence to the values of her sphere. If her needlework was neat, her soul was assumed to be in order. The demand for perpetual sewing was a way to fill the profound void left by her exclusion from the world of genuine accomplishment, masking the soul-crushing boredom of the drawing room. The tyranny of the trousseau and the perpetual mend. The volume and intensity of sewing demanded of a Victorian woman was staggering, turning her life into a continuous cycle of creation and maintenance. Before marriage, a young woman's focus was the trousseau, the collection of clothing and linens she would bring into her marriage. This was not just a few garments, it was an exhaustive inventory of everything she would need for her new life, often including dozens of undergarments, nightgowns, chemises, petticoats, and a multitude of household linens, all requiring meticulous hand-stitching and embroidery. The creation of the trousseau was a years-long commitment, often undertaken in almost total silence with her female relatives. This period was meant to teach patience and submission, but it often felt like a crushing premarital sentence. The sheer complexity and quantity of the needlework ensured that her hands and mind were fully occupied right up until the wedding day, leaving little time for the contemplation of the enormous, non-negotiable step she was about to take. After marriage, the focus shifted from creation to maintenance. In an era before ready-to-wear clothing and easy replacement, the burden of upkeep was immense. Mending and darning. With large families and expensive, heavy fabrics, clothes required constant repair. A tiny hole in a stocking or a tear in a shirt was a project demanding hours of meticulous darning and patching. The woman was expected to keep every garment of every family member in immaculate condition. Economy and labor. This work was often framed as an economic virtue, thriftiness. By tirelessly mending, she saved her husband the cost of purchasing new items. In reality, she was substituting her unpaid, time-consuming labor for capital, chaining her to the work table. The nightmare component was the realization that this work was never finished. Like Penelope weaving her shroud, a woman might finish one pile of mending, only to find another had grown in its place. The work was non-stop, repetitive, and offered no intellectual satisfaction, serving only as a time filler for a life devoid of purpose. Silence, submission, and the suppression of intellect. The physical act of sewing had a direct strategic link to the enforced silence and submission of the Victorian woman. The quiet task. Sewing is a quiet activity. It necessitates a bent head, lowered gaze, and hands that cannot gesture. It is an activity perfectly suited to the drawing room, where the men might be reading, debating, or conducting serious business. A woman with a needle in her hand was physically and socially constrained from interjecting, interrupting, or raising her voice. The stifled mind. The most devastating effect was the suppression of intellect. Needlework is just stimulating enough to prevent absolute daydreaming, but not complex enough to permit focused, deep thought. The brain was kept in a state of semi-occupation, a psychological half-light. If a woman had access to books, a privilege often debated by doctors, she was frequently forced to read light, non-controversial texts or read while simultaneously sewing, fracturing her focus. A weapon against education. The emphasis on needlework was a deliberate counterweight to serious female education. Girl schools of the era often devoted far more time to embroidery and stitchery than to mathematics, sciences, or Latin. The message was clear. Her dexterity with a needle was more valuable to her future role than her proficiency with a pen. The silence imposed by the needle was a profound psychological constraint, forcing women to internalize their thoughts, frustrations, and ambitions.
Neurasthenia and boredom. For educated, intelligent women, especially those in the increasingly comfortable middle class who had domestic help to handle the bulk of the domestic work, the obligation to endlessly sew was a source of acute mental distress. The agony of the superfluous. With domestic help, the ladies' sewing often became entirely superfluous, elaborate decorative pieces that served no practical purpose, or small unnecessary items for charity. The realization that she was spending her limited lifespan on meaningless tasks fueled a deep sense of despair and uselessness. The epidemic of boredom. This led directly to an epidemic of boredom, a profound existential ennui that permeated the drawing rooms of Europe and America. This boredom was not mere laziness. It was the psychological consequence of confining a capable adult mind to an utterly repetitive, non-challenging, and socially insignificant sphere. The outbreak of nerves. This suppressed energy and intellectual starvation manifested as the ubiquitous nerves and neurasthenia. The woman who dared to admit the monotony of her life was instantly diagnosed with an illness. Her frustration with the system was recast as a flaw in her own delicate constitution, forcing her into the cult of the invalid as the only route to acceptable relief. The constant low-level mental irritation of needlework, performed in silence, served as a psychological tourniquet, successfully staunching the flow of intellectual rebellion and channeling female discontent into neurosis. A revolution that became a new chain. The invention of the sewing machine in the mid-19th century, particularly Elias Howe's and Isaac Singer's successful commercial models, promised a massive liberation for women. The machine could do in an hour what took a woman days by hand. However, the iron hand quickly adapted the technology into a new form of constraint. Increased expectations. Since the volume of work was now easier, women were expected to produce more garments, more complex designs, and more elaborate household linens than ever before. The time saved by the machine was immediately absorbed by the demand for greater quantity and perfection. The sweated labor trap. While the machine benefited the lady of the house, it created a new, darker tragedy for working-class women. The sewing machine became the engine of the sweated industries, the cramped, dirty urban workshops where poverty-stricken women, many of them widows or unmarried immigrants, worked 14 to 16 hours a day for starvation wages. These women suffered crippling physical ailments, including repetitive strain injury and blindness, to produce the fashionable garments worn by the ladies who sought to avoid labor. From domestic skill to exploitation. The virtuous domestic task was industrialized, but the price was paid by other, less privileged women, highlighting the vicious class divisions inherent in the domestic ideal. The leisure of the drawing-room lady was often bought with the suffering of the seamstress in the tenement. A room of one's own versus the drawing-room prison. The tragedy of the sewing obsession lay in its profound spatial confinement. The woman's world was the drawing room, the parlor, or the bedroom. She had no room of her own for serious, uninterrupted thought. The drawing room, while elegant, was a social prison. It was the space where she performed her duties and entertained, and where she was expected to be available for conversation or display. The needle in her hand ensured that she was always visible, always busy, always submissive, and never truly alone with her thoughts. The sight of a woman bent over her embroidery, her head bowed, her gaze fixed on the minute task, was the perfect visual metaphor for her constrained intellectual life. The boredom of the drawing room was the emotional outcome of this confinement, a suffocating lack of meaning that was treated as a personal affliction rather than a social symptom. The only path to freedom lay in either descending into a socially sanctioned illness, the invalid cult, or breaking the social contract entirely, a terrifying prospect that risked utter social annihilation. The endless quiet work of the needle was the constant hum of the gilded cage, ensuring the woman remained tethered to the domestic sphere, silently accepting her destiny as the decorative, economically useless, and emotionally chained angel in the house. The precarious balance of a woman's good name. After the relentless emotional pressure of the drawing room, the Victorian woman faced a greater, more volatile enemy, the scrutiny of her peers and the relentless demand for an impeccable reputation. Her existence was predicated upon a delicate social contract, a tightrope walk across a chasm of judgment. The obsession with her good name was not a matter of personal pride, it was an existential necessity, for the slightest misstep, the faintest whisper, the single slander could shatter her life entirely. In an era without social safety nets for women, and where worth was defined by male protection, a woman's reputation was her single, most valuable, and yet most fragile asset. It was the only currency she possessed, and it was perpetually held in a precarious balance, subject to the whims of gossip, jealousy, and the unforgiving laws of the sexual double standard. The woman's only capital. Unlike a man who could recover from professional setbacks or financial ruin by rebuilding his career, a woman possessed no such means of economic or social recovery. Her worth was entirely intangible, her virtue and her reputation. The marriage market. A woman's reputation was her dowry in the marriage market. A pristine reputation signaled to a prospective husband and his family that she was pure, submissive, and would bring no scandal to their name. Any blemish, no matter how small or unfounded, dramatically diminished her eligibility, condemning her to the financial and social difficulties of spinsterhood. Economic dependence. Because most middle and upper-class women were legally barred or socially prevented from earning their own income, they relied entirely on their father or husband for financial security. Losing one's reputation meant losing the prospect of a husband, thus directly ensuring a life of poverty or dependence on distant, often reluctant male relatives. The velvet shield. A good name acted as a velvet shield against the harsh realities of the world. As long as her reputation was intact, she was protected by the strict social codes of respectability. If the shield cracked, the iron hand of society would cast her out, exposing her to humiliation and ruin. The intense focus on her name ensured that the Victorian woman lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, constantly monitoring her every gesture, word, and interaction. The tyranny of propriety and the watchful eye.
The maintenance of a woman's reputation required more than simply adhering to moral law. It demanded an unwavering obedience to propriety, the strict social rules governing outward behavior. The unseen judges. The woman was always under surveillance. Her neighbors, her servants, her husband's colleagues, and even casual acquaintances acted as unseen judges. Every action was filtered through the lens of Victorian morality, which preferred the appearance of virtue over the messy reality of human behavior. The language of evasion. Her conversation had to be strictly guarded. She could never discuss politics, finance, or anything remotely intellectual or passionate. Her speech was meant to be light, deferential, and moralistic. Any display of independent thought or strong opinion risked the slander of being unfeminine, overwrought, or unruly. The burden of propriety was a severe psychological weight, turning every social interaction into a high-stakes performance where the slightest deviation from the prescribed script could prove fatal. The sharpest edge of the slander. The fundamental injustice of the obsession with reputation lay in the sexual double standard, which made the woman's standing infinitely more fragile than a man's. This was the sharpest, most hypocritical edge of the iron hand.
The man's forgivable vice. A man's reputation was largely tied to his financial success and public honor. While he might be privately censured, his sexual indiscretions, visits to brothels, or extramarital affairs were often ignored, whispered about, or excused as the natural expression of his masculine passion. His name might be tarnished, but his career and his wife's status remained largely intact. The woman's absolute fall. For a woman, however, any perceived breach of sexual purity, actual or imagined, was terminal. Chastity was her supreme virtue. The moment it was compromised, she became a fallen woman. Society applied an absolute, unforgiving scale. She was either an angel or a devil, with no acceptable middle ground. The power of the accusation. In many cases, it wasn't even the act itself, but the accusation. The single slander, the mere whisper of impropriety, was often enough to irrevocably destroy her. She had no legal means to defend herself against rumors, and the mud, once thrown, could never be fully cleaned. The woman was perpetually held hostage by the potential malice, jealousy, or casual cruelty of others. Her entire future rested on the discretion and moral conduct of everyone around her, including her male accusers, who would face no parallel consequences. Annihilation of the fallen woman. When the single slander took hold and a woman was deemed fallen, whether through a proven affair, a premature pregnancy, or even the perception of flirtatiousness, her life was systematically annihilated by society. Social death. The woman was cut off from all respectable society. Invitations ceased, friends ceased to call, and her own family often disowned her to protect their own name. She became a non-person, existing in a state of social death. Economic ruin. With her reputation destroyed, all avenues to respectable work were closed. Unmarried, childless women could no longer serve as governesses or companions. The only remaining recourse for economic survival was often the very path society feared: prostitution. The irony was that society's obsession with purity often forced fallen women into the very vice they sought to prevent. Legal disenfranchisement. Under the law, particularly before the Married Women's Property Acts, a wife had no legal standing independent of her husband. If she was ruined, her husband could easily divorce her, though she would have a much harder time divorcing him, regardless of his behavior, and retain full control of their children and assets. The ruined woman was cast out with nothing. The fallen woman became a cautionary tale, her destruction serving as a terrifying warning to all other women to stay safely within the constraints of propriety. paranoia, and isolation. The constant, overwhelming pressure to maintain the precarious balance of her good name led to profound psychological distress. Internalized scrutiny. Women internalized the watchful eye of society, leading to a state of perpetual anxiety and low-grade paranoia. They began to suspect even well-meaning actions and words, constantly editing their own behavior to prevent any possible misinterpretation. This required a relentless, exhausting emotional labor. The prison of innocence. The woman was trapped in the role of the innocent, asexual angel. Any natural human desire, passion, anger, ambition, or curiosity had to be brutally suppressed for fear that it would somehow show on her face or betray her pure image. This required a relentless, exhausting emotional labor. Isolation and lack of confidants. The stakes were too high to confide her genuine feelings, doubts, or frustrations even in her closest female friends. A secret shared could become the single slander that destroyed her. This enforced isolation meant that she suffered her intellectual boredom and emotional turmoil in absolute silence. The price of her good name was her intellectual honesty, her emotional freedom, and her capacity for genuine human connection. The velvet glove required her to live a lie every single day. The irony of aggressive virtue. In a few rare instances, women attempted to fight back against the single slander, but even their defense often reinforced the system that oppressed them. Legal recourse. Libel and slander laws were primarily designed for men to protect their business interests. For women, lawsuits over reputation were ruinously expensive and often counterproductive. The public discussion of the supposed impropriety in a courtroom often served to amplify the scandal rather than quash it. Aggressive innocence. The only effective defense was an aggressive, public performance of virtue and absolute innocence. She had to be more pious, more submissive, and more retiring than ever before, doubling down on the very repression that was making her miserable. This was a psychological win for the Iron Hand. Even in defense, she had to commit more fully to the role of the constrained angel. The obsession with reputation was the ultimate tool of social enforcement. It cost nothing to implement, required the entire community to police, and had the power to destroy a woman's life with nothing more than a whispered word. How over-emotionalism masked true depression. Having been confined to the drawing room and terrified by the threat of slander, the Victorian woman found one last narrow channel for expressing her profound inner turmoil: acceptable, exaggerated emotion. The Victorian era, while valuing stoicism in men, embraced a paradoxical, tearful ideal for women. Excessive sentimentality and emotional volatility became not a flaw, but an expected feminine trait, a dramatic public display of sensitivity and delicate nerves. This obsession became a devastating coping mechanism. Over-emotionalism provided a momentary socially sanctioned outlet for the intense psychological pressure of the gilded cage. Yet this performance had a cruel side effect. It effectively masked true depression and other severe mental illnesses, ensuring that genuine suffering was either dismissed as female sensibility or pathologized as hysteria, rather than treated as a serious medical condition. Sentimentality as a social currency. The tearful ideal was inextricably linked to the angel in the house construct. The woman was the moral and emotional core of the home, and her supposed heightened sensitivity was proof of her purity and superior moral status. The virtue of feeling. In contrast to the rough, rational, and emotionless male world of commerce, the woman's sphere was meant to be one of deep feeling, empathy, and spirituality.
Crying easily, blushing quickly, and being overcome by sentiment were seen as evidence of her untouched, pure soul, a visual demonstration that she was emotionally attuned to the higher moral truths. The language of the heart. Since women were forbidden to express ambition, anger, or intellectual frustration, they had to rely on the language of the heart, emotions, to communicate need. A flood of tears could often achieve what a rational argument could not: attention, temporary reprieve from duty, or the softening of a husband's resolve. Literary and artistic reinforcement. Victorian novels, poetry, and art saturated the culture with images of the beautifully suffering woman. The heroine was often portrayed weeping over a letter, fainting from shock, or languishing in deep melancholy. This reinforced the idea that intense emotional volatility was not a disease, but a marker of profound feminine complexity. This obsession created a culture where emotional performance was prized, forcing women into the exhausting labor of always feeling and displaying their feelings dramatically, even if they were internally numb. The performance of grief and sympathy. The mandatory mourning rituals were the most public stage for the tearful ideal. The expectation to display overwhelming grief was so high that it bordered on the theatrical. Emotional excess as duty. If a woman's tears were not readily forthcoming at a funeral, she risked the single slander of being heartless, unfeeling, or even relieved by the death of her husband. She had to summon genuine or artificial tears to validate her role as the devoted, suffering wife. Sympathy fatigue. The constant demand to be emotionally available, to manage the emotional burdens of the entire family, to visit the poor and sick, and to appear empathetic at all times led to profound emotional fatigue. This fatigue often manifested as the very nervous symptoms that were then misdiagnosed as nerves rather than treated as a serious medical condition.
The exaggerated response. The acceptance of over-emotionalism meant that when a woman did suffer a genuinely traumatic event, her response had to be exaggerated to be taken seriously. A subtle depression might be missed entirely, while a hysterical outburst or a dramatic collapse was instantly recognized and validated within the framework of female frailty. The iron hand here was the pressure to always feel more, ensuring that genuine, quiet suffering remained unheard. The silence of the soul. The acceptance of theatrical emotionality created a perfect shield for hiding severe mental illness, particularly true depression, or clinical melancholy, as it was sometimes called. Dismissal as sensibility. Symptoms of clinical depression: persistent despair, profound lethargy, anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure, or crippling guilt, were often interpreted as mere heightened sensibility or a temporary state of nerves common to the female sex. Because women were supposed to be emotional, their deep destructive pain was normalized and minimized. The paradox of the tearless woman. The most tragic victims were often those who suffered from atypical depression, where the symptom was not torrents of tears, but an overwhelming numbness, an inability to cry or feel anything. Since they failed to perform the expected tearful ideal, these women were often accused of being cold, unfeeling, or even immoral. They were doubly punished, first by their disease, and second by the judgment that they were failing to be properly feminine. Suicidal ideation. When the depression became severe, leading to suicidal ideation, a hidden scourge of the drawing rooms, the woman had nowhere to turn. To express a desire to end her life would be the ultimate admission of failure, a rejection of her sacred domestic role, and a sign of profound moral or religious failing. She suffered the final stages of her illness in utter silence. The very mechanism that was supposed to allow female expression, sentimentality, was used to effectively silence the most serious forms of female pain. Nerves versus mind. The medical establishment, rooted in the concepts of the rest cure and hysteria, systematically confused emotional display with psychological disease. They treated the nerves and the body, but rarely the mind, treating the symptom, not the cause. When a depressed woman was sent to a doctor, her physical symptoms, headaches, insomnia, lack of appetite, were treated with tonics, bromide, or even opiates. The underlying cause, intellectual starvation, social isolation, and the absence of agency, was completely ignored because the male doctors believed her condition was purely physiological, an issue with her womb or her nerves, and not existential. The hysterical label. Any deviation from the expected dramatic sentimentality, such as genuine anger, sustained intellectual thought, or quiet withdrawal, was immediately labeled as hysteria. This diagnosis, though it led to oppressive treatments like the rest cure, ironically provided a respectable reason for her behavior, allowing her to stay within the cult of the invalid rather than face the shame of melancholy, depression. The lack of psychological language. The Victorian vocabulary for mental illness in women was dominated by moral terms: morbid, melancholy, nervous, and hysterical. There was no framework to understand or discuss complex trauma, emotional abuse, or simple clinical chemical imbalance in the brain. The woman's soul was dying of emptiness, but the doctor only saw her weak nerves. The Iron Hand disguised true psychological suffering by providing a false, theatrical substitute. Emotional labor and fragmentation. The obsession with the tearful ideal demanded an incredible amount of emotional labor from the Victorian woman, fragmenting her sense of self. 1. Living the lie. She was required to live a life of manufactured emotion. She had to pretend delight in social calls, enthusiasm for trivial domestic projects, and submission to her husband's often tedious pronouncements. This continuous performance created a dangerous schism between her public, emotional self and her private, despondent self. 2. Chronic self-doubt. Because her own feelings were pathologized and dismissed, the woman began to doubt the reality of her own pain. If society told her she was delicate and her symptoms were normal for her sex, she questioned whether her deep despair was merely a personal moral failing or a sign of her own unworthiness, further spiraling her into depression. 3. The vicious cycle. The structure of the gilded cage ensured that the forces causing her depression, boredom, silence, lack of purpose, were identical to the forces that masked it. She cried because she was trapped, and her tears were accepted as proof that she was too delicate to be freed. The cycle was self-perpetuating. The woman who suffered from genuine, paralyzing depression was forced to play the part of the sentimental, volatile Victorian heroine, ensuring that the tearful ideal kept the velvet glove firmly pulled over the true depression beneath. Literature and the unspoken scream. It is only through the literature of the era, particularly American writers like Charlotte Perkins Gilman, that the unspoken scream of the bored and depressed woman begins to emerge. Gilman's famous work, The Yellow Wallpaper, is a powerful indictment of the medical and social obsession with female emotionality. The narrator, suffering from what we now recognize as severe postpartum depression and anxiety, is subjected to the rest cure. Forbidden to write, her only creative outlet, she is told to engage in minimal emotional and intellectual activity. Her descent into madness is a literalization of the Victorian woman's condition. The wallpaper, with its complex, confusing pattern, represents the oppressive and illogical social system, and the woman trapped behind it is the repressed female self. The story argues that the cure, enforced emotional passivity, was far more devastating than the disease. The tearful ideal therefore stands as a cruel, enduring monument to the Victorian failure to recognize and treat the genuine mental health crisis caused by the systematic destruction of female selfhood and agency. The diagnosis of hysteria and the rest cure. The culmination of the Victorian woman's struggle against her confines, the tight lacing, the endless sewing, and the stifled intellect, was a psychological explosion that society refused to recognize as a legitimate. Her despair, her frustration, her profound existential melancholia was not seen as a rational response to her oppression.
Instead, the iron hand of the medical establishment seized upon it, formalizing her suffering under the all-encompassing misogynistic diagnosis of hysteria. The prescribed solution was the most brutal form of domestic imprisonment, the rest cure. This was the point where the emotional chains became literal shackles. The medical complex, rooted in male authority, transformed a sociological problem, female subjugation, into a physiological disease, ensuring that the system that caused the suffering was preserved and the suffering woman was deemed the flawed subject. Hysteria, the ancient scapegoat reborn. The concept of hysteria, derived from the Greek word hysterica, meaning of the womb, was an ancient diagnosis that experienced a powerful and destructive resurgence in the Victorian era. It became the ultimate catch-all term for any female behavior that deviated from the prescribed path of submissive domesticity. 1. The unstable womb theory. Victorian physicians largely maintained the belief that the female uterus was the source of all her emotional and nervous instability. It was theorized that the uterus was an independent entity that could wander or cause congestion, leading to various nervous symptoms. This belief system immediately shifted the blame for a woman's unhus from the oppressive social structure to her own inherent flawed biology. The symptoms of suppression. The list of hysterical symptoms was immense and vague, encompassing everything from headaches, fainting, temporary paralysis, insomnia, anxiety, and extreme irritability, to what doctors called morbid cravings or undue excitement. In reality, these were the natural psychological outlets for suppressed anger, denied intellectual ambition, and suffocating boredom, the consequences of the gilded cage. The gendered diagnosis. Crucially, hysteria was almost exclusively a female diagnosis. While men experienced similar nervous collapses, often termed neurasthenia, or nervous exhaustion, the female version was always tied to her reproductive system,
reinforcing the idea that her identity and her illness were inseparable from her biological destiny as a wife and mother. The diagnosis of hysteria provided the ultimate tool for controlling female discontent. It discredited her, pathologized her suffering, and justified the need for aggressive, often punitive treatment. Imprisonment by prescription. For women whose hysteria proved particularly resistant to simple home remedies and advice, American physician Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, 1829 to 1914, developed the notorious rest cure. This treatment was not designed for physical healing, but for psychological enforcement, a coercive tool aimed at breaking the independent spirit and enforcing the passive obedience of the angel in the house. The cure's first and most critical component was total isolation. Removal from the scene. The patient was forcibly separated from her family, friends, and home environment. This was rationalized as removing her from the excitement of her life, but its true function was to sever her emotional and intellectual lifelines. The watchful nurse. She was placed in a secluded room, often under the constant, stern supervision of a nurse or attendant, a constant, visible symbol of the iron hand's control. Letters were monitored, and visits were forbidden. This isolation quickly created profound dependency on her caregivers and submission to their regime. The core of Mitchell's method was the enforced suppression of all physical and mental activity. Bed rest as sentence. The woman was confined strictly to bed for weeks, sometimes months, without the ability to move freely. This caused her muscles to atrophy, making her physically weak and entirely dependent on her caregivers for basic needs. The ban on thought. She was forbidden to read, write, sew, or even engage in intellectual conversation. This was a deliberate attempt at intellectual starvation, aimed at reducing her mind to a state of near tabula rasa, eliminating the dangerous thoughts and ambitions that had caused her nerves to fail. The message was clear: your mind is too volatile, and your body must rule your existence. The final component of the rest cure was designed to restore physical and thus psychological obedience. The high-fat diet.
Patients were force-fed an excessive diet of high-fat foods, often milk, cream, and fatty meats, designed to make them gain weight rapidly. This was symbolic. It tied the woman to the earth, making her less ethereal and more materially grounded, supposedly stabilizing her errant nervous system. Massage and electrotherapy. The forced passivity was offset by daily massage and rudimentary electrotherapy, mild shocks, which were given to prevent complete physical deterioration while simultaneously reinforcing the woman's lack of control over her own body. The treatment was administered to her, not initiated by her. The destruction of the independent spirit. The rest cure was a devastating success in its primary goal of breaking the will of the woman who dared to exhibit ambition or intellectual drive. The psychological breakdown. The combination of isolation, sensory deprivation, and forced passivity caused many women to suffer genuine psychological breakdowns. Their sense of self fragmented, and they often emerged docile, obedient, and psychologically reliant on male authority figures, exactly as the system intended. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's testimony. The most famous victim of the rest cure was the American author Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Prescribed the cure by Dr. Mitchell himself for what we now understand was severe postpartum depression and anxiety, she was told to live as domestic a life as possible, never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again. She followed his advice and came perilously close to madness. Her powerful short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, is a literal account of the psychological damage. A searing indictment of a medical practice that mistook an intelligent woman's need for work and purpose for illness. The narrator, forbidden to write, projects her desperation onto the hideous, illogical pattern of her bedroom wallpaper, seeing a woman trapped behind the bars of its design, a metaphor for the Victorian woman trapped by the illogical constraints of her life. The self-betrayal. The hardest part of the cure was the woman's internalization of the system's lies. She was led to believe that her ambition was a biological defect. She was forced to betray her own desires for intellectual fulfillment, coming out of the treatment convinced that her true path was obedience and domestic servitude. The medical irony, treating the shadow of the disease while ignoring the substance. The immense tragedy of hysteria and the rest cure lies in the profound irony that the medical establishment was treating the shadow of the disease while ignoring the substance of it. Social cause, medical cure. The root cause of the hysteria epidemic was the social limitation placed on women, the lack of education, the absence of property rights, the economic dependence, and the denial of meaningful work. The Victorian doctor, unwilling or unable to confront these social realities, invented a medical cure that required the woman to adhere even more strictly to the constraints that made her ill in the first place. Confusion with real ailments. Because hysteria was such a catch-all diagnosis, it often masked genuine, severe, and treatable conditions, including undiagnosed thyroid disorders, nutritional deficiencies, and severe clinical depression. By labeling the patient hysterical, the doctor often stopped seeking the actual physical or psychological cause. The misuse of technology. The use of rudimentary electrotherapy during the rest cure further mystified the condition, suggesting a scientific approach to a purely sociological problem. This use of technology lent credibility to the idea that the woman's nerves needed to be shocked back into line, obscuring the simple truth that her soul needed meaningful engagement. The rise of the asylums. For the hysterical woman whose family could not afford the expensive rest cure, or for those whose symptoms crossed the line from manageable nerves to full-blown madness, often triggered by the very treatments prescribed, the final destination was the asylum. The ultimate confinement. Victorian private and public asylums filled rapidly with women whose behaviors violated social norms. A woman could be committed for a variety of vague reasons that included moral deficiency, overexcitement, religious ecstasy, or puerperal insanity, postpartum psychosis. The husband's power. Under the law, a man had vast power over his wife's body and liberty. Before reforms, a husband could often commit his wife to asylum with minimal medical testimony, often using the diagnosis of hysteria to simply dispose of an inconvenient or rebellious spouse. The asylum was the ultimate manifestation of the iron hand, a place where the performance of female fragility was discarded entirely, and women were met with physical restraint and institutional control. A fate worse than death. For a respectable woman, being institutionalized in an asylum was considered a fate worse than social death. It was the final total erasure of her name and identity, sealing her isolation from the world forever. The diagnosis of hysteria and the imposition of the rest cure thus stand as the era's most powerful indictment of medicalized misogyny. They were not attempts to heal women, but efforts to enforce conformity, turning the intellectual ambition of a lady's melancholia into a profitable, controllable disease. The iron hand found its most devastating weapon in the guise of medical treatment. Perpetual pregnancy and the risk of the lying-in room. The Victorian woman's destiny was ultimately reduced to a single biological function, reproduction. If her body was not performing its duty by being laced, veiled, or sick, it was expected to be perpetually serving the womb's vow, the relentless cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing. This obsession with procreation was the most fundamental constraint imposed by the iron hand, directly defining her value, endangering her life, and chaining her to the most vulnerable domestic space, the lying-in room. In an age before reliable contraception, large families were the norm and often an economic necessity. Yet for the middle and upper-class woman, perpetual pregnancy was an emotionally and physically exhausting sentence, accepted not with joy, but with fatalistic resignation.
The ideological imperative, duty and destiny. The demand for large families was rooted deeply in the era's economic, religious, and political philosophies. The woman was not just bearing children for herself, she was serving the nation and God. National duty. Britain was a rapidly expanding empire. Producing children, particularly sons, was viewed as a patriotic duty, providing soldiers, colonists, and workers to fuel the industrial machine and govern the growing territories. The woman who birthed many children was deemed a successful contributor to the national project. Religious command. For devout Victorians, procreation was a fundamental biblical command. Any attempt to prevent or limit conception was often viewed as sinful, a selfish rejection of God's will. The woman's purpose was to be fruitful, and to resist this was to risk moral damnation. Economic necessity for men. In the absence of state pensions or social security, children, especially sons, were the only reliable insurance policy for a man's old age. The pressure on the wife to produce heirs and future caregivers was immense, tying her reproductive health directly to her husband's future economic security. The womb's vow thus became the central measure of a woman's success in her entire life. A woman who failed to conceive or who only produced daughters faced social stigma, medical suspicion, and the constant threat of being replaced in her husband's affections. The cycle of exhaustion, continuous conception. The absence of reliable and socially acceptable contraception meant that for many women, the years between their marriage and menopause were a relentless, unbroken cycle of pregnancy. The staggering frequency. A woman marrying at 20 could easily endure 10 to 15 pregnancies. Her life became a repetitive pattern, 9 months pregnant, followed by 12 to 18 months of nursing, followed almost immediately by conception again. Physical depletion. This continuous cycle led to profound physical depletion. Her body was constantly taxed, first by growing a fetus and then by providing the primary source of nutrition, breast milk. Chronic iron deficiency, calcium depletion, and physical exhaustion were endemic, contributing to the very frailty that the cult of the invalid celebrated. Marital obligation. Even when ill or exhausted, the woman was expected to submit to her husband's conjugal demands. While Victorian ideology preached female sexual passivity and asexuality, the man's needs were considered natural and imperative. The wife was often forced into a position where her marital duty inevitably led to her next pregnancy, further reinforcing her lack of control over her own body. The emotional toll was immense. Pregnancy became less a joyous anticipation and more a dreaded certainty, transforming the woman's natural function into a continuous emotional and physical burden. The perils of the lying-in room. The act of childbirth, known as the lying-in, was the single most dangerous event in a Victorian woman's life. The lying-in room, the bedroom where she gave birth and remained confined afterwards, was the physical location of the Iron Hand's greatest peril. Maternal mortality. The maternal mortality rates were terrifyingly high, particularly in urban areas. Childbirth was the leading cause of death for women of reproductive age. Death was often caused not by the difficulty of the birth itself, but by the rampant infection known as puerperal fever or childbed fever. This deadly bacterial infection was spread by attending doctors and midwives who, ignorant of germ theory for much of the era, moved directly from performing autopsies or treating other patients to delivering babies without washing their hands. The very man who was supposed to save her life was often the agent of her death. The aftermath, confinement and ritual. After the birth, the woman was subjected to a period of mandatory confinement in the lying-in room, typically lasting a month or more. This was not just a period of rest, it was a ritualistic separation from the rest of the household to allow her to recover and prove her strength before rejoining society. While sounding restful, this confinement often led to profound boredom, emotional stress, and tragically, conditions like puerperal insanity or postpartum depression, which could result in a woman being committed to an asylum. The fear of the lying-in room hung over every married Victorian woman like a death sentence, transforming her essential biological role into a terrifying gamble with her life. Puerperal insanity, when the womb breaks the mind. For the woman whose psychological state crumbled under the relentless pressure of childbearing, the Iron Hand delivered a diagnosis that was both tragic and terrifying: puerperal insanity, or postpartum depression. The moral failure. Unlike physical illnesses, puerperal insanity was often viewed not just as a medical problem, but a moral failure, a sign that the woman's fragile nervous system was not strong enough to meet the sacred demands of motherhood. The symptoms and stigma. Symptoms ranged from severe depression and catatonia to violent hallucinations and a complete inability to bond with the child. Because the illness was directly tied to the sacred role of motherhood, the stigma was immense. Families often concealed the illness, terrified of the social ruin it would bring. The asylum route. Unlike the hysterical woman who might be treated with the rest cure, the woman suffering from puerperal insanity was a genuine danger to herself and her child. This often led to immediate commitment to an asylum where she would be kept far away from society, her illness serving as the ultimate cautionary tale about the instability of the female mind. Her destruction was complete. She had fulfilled the womb's vow only to have the womb destroy her mind. The lack of control. Family planning as a moral minefield. The woman's lack of control over her own reproductive destiny was the most crippling aspect of this obsession. Legal and religious barriers. Explicit discussions of contraception were socially forbidden and often legally restricted under obscenity laws. The dissemination of any information on family planning was considered an attack on morality and public order. The rhythm method and withdrawal. The only methods of birth control available were often unreliable, such as the rhythm method, which was poorly understood, or coitus interruptus, withdrawal.
The woman had to rely on her husband's cooperation and self-control for these methods to work, leaving the responsibility and the blame for failure firmly in his hands. Abortion as last resort. When all else failed and the idea of another pregnancy was physically or psychologically unbearable, desperate women sometimes resorted to back-alley abortions, which were illegal, highly dangerous, and morally condemned. This was the darkest, most terrifying choice available to a woman driven to the brink by the womb's vow, risking not only her reputation but her life at the hands of often unskilled practitioners. The iron hand ensured that the woman had no legal, social, or moral authority to control the functions of her own body, making her reproductive life a brutal, relentless act of submission to external demands. Emotional devastation, lost identity. Beyond the physical and mortal risks, perpetual pregnancy led to a profound loss of identity and selfhood. Motherhood as total identity. The woman's roles as wife, companion, and individual were subsumed entirely into the role of mother. Her continuous state of pregnancy or nursing left little room for intellectual pursuit, personal development, or any activity not centered on her children. She lost her name to her children, her health to her husband, and her identity to the collective. Fractured relationship with children. The sheer number of children, coupled with the frequent pregnancies and post-birth exhaustion, meant that the woman often struggled to form close individual bonds with each child. They were loved, but they also represented the continuous destruction of her body and the endless confinement of her life. The cult of the child. The Victorian era saw a romanticization of the child, who was often seen as pure and angelic. This cult of the child placed the mother under immense pressure to be equally pure and self-sacrificing, further erasing her own needs and desires in favor of her offspring. Her life was an endless, exhausting, and often fatal process of giving, with no reciprocal support for her own psychological well-being.
Marriage as economic survival, not romantic love. The romantic myth of the Victorian era, perpetuated through its sentimental literature and celebrated poetry, hinges on the ideal of passionate, life-altering love, culminating in a blissful marriage. For the vast majority of Victorian women, however, the reality was a brutal, cold calculation. Marriage was not the pursuit of a soulmate, it was the great transaction, a necessary, often desperate pact for economic survival. This obsession cemented the most powerful of the societal chains, dictating a woman's entire destiny and ensuring her perpetual legal and financial subjugation. The iron hand of patriarchy was never more evident than in the marriage contract. It stripped a woman of her legal identity and property rights, rendering her utterly dependent on the man she married. Her primary virtue was her ability to make a good match, and her failure to do so often meant a grim, precarious life of poverty and social scorn. Coverture and civil death. The foundation of marriage as an economic chain was the prevailing English common law doctrine known as coverture, which remained largely intact for the first half of the Victorian era. Legal erasure. Coverture decreed that, upon marriage, the legal existence of the wife was suspended or covered by that of her husband. As the English jurist William Blackstone famously summarized, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of her husband. This suspension meant that any property, wages, or assets a woman owned before or acquired after the marriage instantly became the legal property of her husband. She could not sign contracts, sue or be sued, or manage her own finances. Even the clothing on her back legally belonged to him.
The loss of earnings. For working-class women, this meant that their hard-earned wages belonged solely to their husbands. For wealthy women, even their inheritance was usually managed and often dissipated entirely by the man. The lack of control over her economic life made the woman entirely beholden to her husband's financial judgment and generosity, which was often lacking. Marriage, then, in the legal sense, was a form of civil death for the woman. She exchanged her autonomy for security, making the transaction less about love and more about a calculated financial risk. A high-stakes financial negotiation. The process of finding a husband was openly viewed as a market negotiation where the woman's only commodity was her reputation, beauty, often artificially enforced by the corset and cosmetics, and her dowry. A man entering marriage was primarily seeking a partner who would manage his home efficiently, produce legitimate heirs, and maintain the social standing necessary for his career advancement. He also sought an adequate dowry, funds or property provided by the bride's family to the groom. The dowry was essential, as it helped finance the couple's new life and served as the bride's only financial insurance in case of widowhood. The woman's goal was purely survival. She had to secure a man who had sufficient prospects, a man whose financial trajectory promised long-term stability. The negotiation was between the two families, often guided by financial lawyers, with the woman herself having minimal say. Age and urgency. The pressure was highest on young women. A woman's market value peaked around the age of 18 to 20. Every year past that, her value declined. By 25, she risked becoming a spinster, a woman condemned to a life of dependence, often relegated to the uncomfortable role of a relative's unpaid help or a governess. The fear of spinsterhood was a constant driving force behind the obsession with securing the great transaction. The burden of the spinster and the unmarried life. The alternative to marriage was so socially and economically devastating that it fueled the desperate nature of the marriage obsession. Social isolation. The unmarried woman was seen as incomplete, a failure of the feminine ideal. She was often pitied, or worse, suspected of some hidden moral flaw, the single slander. She was excluded from the comfortable society enjoyed by wives and mothers. Economic precarity. An unmarried woman, unless she was born into extraordinary wealth or had exceptionally liberal parents, faced financial uncertainty. Even if she earned her own money, a rarity, she was constantly battling to be paid fairly and struggling to save enough for her old age. The lack of social support meant poverty was always one illness or economic downturn away. The governess trap. One of the few respectable professions open to educated, unmarried middle-class women was that of the governess. This was a position defined by profound isolation. Too educated to socialize with the servants, and too employed to socialize with the mistress. The governess lived a life caught between social classes, enduring immense emotional labor for pitiable wages, often under the constant threat of dismissal. The Iron Hand presented a clear choice, either complete legal subjugation in marriage or lifelong economic vulnerability in spinsterhood. The vast majority of women chose the perceived safety of the chain. A slow, painful change. The injustice of coverture was so egregious that it spurred one of the most significant legal reforms of the century, the Married Women's Property Acts, MWPA, a direct attack on the economic foundation of the gilded cage. The need for reform. Reform movements, often led by women themselves, argued that coverture was morally indefensible and economically unsound, particularly when husbands squandered their wives' inheritances, leaving families destitute. The Acts of 1870 and 1882 in Britain. The MWPA of 1870 allowed women to legally keep their own wages and small inheritances. The pivotal MWPA of 1882 completely overturned coverture, granting married women the right to own, buy, and sell property in their own names, legally separating their assets from their husbands. The American struggle. In the United States, states slowly adopted similar laws, often beginning with protecting women's real estate from their husbands' debts. However, these changes were fiercely resisted, and often came too late for the generation of women trapped in early Victorian marriages. While these acts were revolutionary, they changed the legal structure much faster than the social reality. The fundamental obsession that a woman's primary duty was to marry well persisted, making the transaction still paramount to her security. From love to duty. For the woman who successfully completed the great transaction, the psychological shift from fiancée to wife was often jarring. The brief period of romance was replaced by the relentless reality of duty. The disappearance of the lover, the husband, now secured in his legal authority, often ceased the courtship and expected immediate, unquestioning obedience. The wife found her life consumed by the duties of the household, childbearing, the womb's vow, and maintaining the social standing essential for her career advancement. Lack of recourse. If the marriage was unhappy, marked by financial neglect, emotional cruelty, or even physical abuse, which was not easily punishable under the law, the wife had virtually no recourse. Divorce was extremely difficult, prohibitively expensive, and almost always resulted in her social ruin and the loss of her children. The transactional nature of the contract meant there was no easy exit once the price of security had been paid.
The legacy of the economic marriage. The Victorian obsession with marriage as an economic contract laid the groundwork for modern debates about economic equality and marriage. The intense fear of the spinster's poverty, the legal theft of women's wages, and the total subjugation under coverture all served as critical catalysts for the feminist movements that demanded both property rights and the vote. The era proved that the gilded cage was held together not by love or morality alone, but by a brutally simple economic reality. A woman needed a man's name to survive, and society ensured that the price of that name was her legal and financial freedom. The velvet glove was the wedding dress, the iron hand was the marriage certificate. The entire social structure, from the corsets they wore to the silence they kept, reinforced the necessity of marriage, making the great transaction the central, life-defining obsession that controlled the fate of almost every woman. The angel and the fallen, the absolute tyranny of sexual innocence. The most potent and destructive obsession enforced by the societal chains of the Victorian age was the absolute, non-negotiable requirement of sexual innocence. Purity was the bedrock upon which the entire social hierarchy of respectable womanhood rested. It was the virtue that determined a woman's fate, sealing her in the gilded cage or casting her into the deepest economic and social abyss. This obsession created a devastating, unforgiving dichotomy. A woman was either the angel, a being of untouched purity, or the fallen, a creature utterly annihilated by a single moral trespass. This was the absolute tyranny of sexual innocence, where a single deviation from the code meant total destruction.
The iron hand of morality was wielded most brutally here, ensuring that while the man's sexual life was characterized by a broad spectrum of acceptable indulgence, the single slander, the woman's was a knife edge, perfection or annihilation. The ideological foundation, asexuality as virtue. The Victorian ideal of womanhood demanded that the middle and upper-class woman be fundamentally asexual. Her role was to be the moral guardian of the home, a serene, passionless being who was a repository of virtue, untainted by base physical appetites. The myth of the passionless woman. Medical and social doctrine widely propagated the belief that respectable women did not possess sexual desire. As Dr. William Acton famously wrote, "The majority of women, happily for society, are not much troubled with sexual feeling." This myth served a crucial social function. It separated the respectable wife, the angel, from the prostitute, the one presumed to have desire. And it ensured that marriage remained a contract of duty and procreation, not mutual pleasure. Purity was a state of being. Innocence was more than just virginity. It was a state of mind. It meant being ignorant of sexual matters, being reserved in conversation, and displaying no hint of worldliness or passion. Any spark of curiosity, any sign of flirtatiousness was viewed as a dangerous crack in her moral armor. The marriage bed was a test. Even within marriage, the woman was expected to remain passive and submit to her husband's needs out of duty, the womb's vow, not personal desire. Her purity was upheld by her reluctance. Her compliance was a sacrifice for her husband's moral stability. This ideology meant that a woman was required to live an emotional and biological lie, suppressing one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience for the sake of social acceptance. The angel, a life of perfect, constrained virtue. The angel in the house was the woman who successfully navigated this tyranny. She was the ideal, but her perfection came at the cost of her genuine selfhood. To maintain the status of the angel, the woman had to live in perpetual fear and denial. She had to deny her intellectual curiosity, lest she read improper materials, deny her body, lest she appeared too sensual, and deny her feelings, lest she appeared too passionate. Her purity became the lock on her gilded cage. The need to protect her innocence justified her confinement to the domestic sphere, her lack of education, and her economic dependence. Every restriction was framed as a necessary measure to guard her most precious asset, her virtue. Her position on the pedestal was incredibly precarious. Her purity was so fragile that it could be shattered by a single encounter, a momentary lapse, or even a false accusation, the single slander. She lived in constant dread that a single misplaced glance or word could irrevocably shift her identity from angel to fallen. The angel was respected, secure, and admired, but she was fundamentally an empty vessel, her life defined by what she was forced to deny rather than what she was allowed to be. The fallen woman, total social annihilation. The fallen woman was the tragic consequence of the tyranny of innocence. She was the woman who had, by choice or coercion, lost her sexual purity before or outside the marriage contract. Her punishment was swift, absolute, and designed to serve as a brutal warning to all other women. The definition of the fall. The fall encompassed a wide range of actions: premarital sex, adultery, or becoming pregnant out of wedlock. Crucially, the category also included victims of sexual assault, who were often treated with the same contempt as those who had sinned willingly. Their purity was compromised, and that was all that mattered. Social death and exile. The fallen woman suffered total social annihilation. The great transaction was irrevocably canceled. She was disowned by her family, shunned by all respectable society, and stripped of her name. Her social identity was erased, forcing her into a state of exile where she could no longer access the normal means of survival. Economic ruin and prostitution. With her reputation destroyed, every avenue for respectable employment, governess, companion, shop worker, was closed. Facing starvation, the primary survival option left to her was often the very trade society condemned: prostitution. The irony was acute. Society's obsession with enforcing purity often created the very class of women it most feared and reviled. The fallen woman, therefore, was not merely judged, she was systematically destroyed, her ruin serving as a public sacrifice to the god of Victorian morality. The sexual double standard, the ultimate hypocrisy. The tyranny of innocence was made absolute by the hypocrisy of the sexual double standard, which ensured that the fall was an experience reserved almost exclusively for women. The man's privilege. The Victorian man was expected to be worldly, experienced, and knowledgeable. Premarital sexual activity was often excused as a necessary rite of passage or an uncontrollable biological imperative. A man could frequent brothels, keep mistresses, and engage in affairs, and while his wife might suffer emotionally, his reputation and his social standing would remain largely unimpeded. The asymmetric blame. In any scandal involving both a man and a woman, the full weight of blame and social penalty fell upon the woman. If a woman bore an illegitimate child, she was the sole object of scorn, while the father's identity was often protected, and his life continued unimpeded. Moral accounting. The man's life was an account book, where minor sexual debts could be paid off through public philanthropy or professional success. The woman's life was a single ledger, marked purity. Once the ink was spilled, the book was irrevocably closed. This unequal moral accounting was the sharpest tool of the iron hand.
The attempts at redemption and the moral maze. For the ruined woman, the path to redemption was a maze of moral conditions designed to be almost impossible to traverse. The Magdalene institutions. Institutions like Magdalene laundries or reformatories were created ostensibly to rescue fallen women. However, these were often cruel, punitive places characterized by grueling, unpaid labor, often laundry or sewing, linking back to the needle and the nightmare, and enforced silence. The rescue was often another form of institutional confinement, designed to break the woman's spirit through endless physical toil and moral instruction. Conditional forgiveness. Forgiveness, if it came at all, was typically contingent on her never attempting to re-enter respectable society. She was allowed to exist only on the moral fringes, perpetually wearing the stigma of her past. She could serve the poor, work in a remote charity, or be an unpaid maid in a relative's house, but never again could she claim the status of the angel. Literary mercy. Writers like Elizabeth Gaskell, Ruth, and Thomas Hardy, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, attempted to critique the unforgiving nature of this moral code, portraying the fallen woman as a tragic victim of circumstance and male hypocrisy. However, these literary critiques often struggled against the dominant social reality, which preferred the simple moral categorization over complex human empathy. Internalized shame.
The psychological destruction wrought by the tyranny of innocence was often more profound than the social ruin. Women were conditioned from birth to believe their entire worth was contingent upon their purity. Chronic fear. The constant fear of the fall bred a crippling anxiety among all women. They had to perpetually doubt every man, every situation, and every impulse of their own body. Internalized shame. For the women who fell, the resultant shame was absolute. Having internalized society's rigid judgment, she often viewed herself as morally contaminated, sometimes leading to self-harm, emotional withdrawal, or a descent into genuine madness, a lady's melancholia. She was not just ruined by society, she felt utterly ruined in her own soul. Sexual ignorance. The mandate for purity led to a profound sexual ignorance that crippled women even in marriage. Unprepared for the realities of the marital bed, many found the experience frightening, confusing, and painful, further cementing the psychological barrier between them and their husbands. The obsession with purity created a society where female sexuality was seen as an unstable, dangerous force that needed to be ruthlessly suppressed or pathologized. The cost was the woman's right to natural desire, self-knowledge, and moral parity with men. The legacy of the Gilded Cage's moral lock. The Victorian tyranny of sexual innocence serves as the moral key to the entire Gilded Cage. The angel's fear kept her compliant, and the fallen woman's destruction proved the cost of defiance. This moral lock was eventually broken by the slow rise of education, economic independence made possible by the Married Women's Property Acts, and the feminist movement, which demanded an end to the sexual double standard. However, the cultural echo of this obsession, the disproportionate focus on female purity, and the shaming of female sexuality continues to shape social discourse today. The Victorian obsession of dividing women into the sacred angel and the condemned fallen woman was the ultimate expression of the iron hand using morality to systematically control, silence, and destroy the lives of women who dared to be fully human. The punishment for failing the purity test. The corset and the veil were physical constraints. The needle and the dowry were emotional and economic chains. But when a Victorian woman broke free of these restraints, when her spirit refused the silence, her mind rejected the prescribed role, or her body failed the test of absolute purity, society possessed one final, unassailable mechanism of control: the asylum gates. The insane asylum was not merely a hospital for the mentally ill. It was the ultimate, unforgiving prison for the woman who defied the code. It was the destination for the fallen, the rebellious, the melancholy, and the inconvenient wife. The diagnosis of madness was the final, absolute punishment for failing the purity test, serving as a legal and social mechanism to erase her name, confiscate her property, and seal her in perpetual isolation. The iron hand found its most chilling and effective lock in the cold stone walls of the institution. Inconvenience, not illness. In the Victorian era, the line between social deviance and mental derangement was dangerously blurred, particularly for women. The legal power afforded to husbands and male relatives ensured that the asylum became a convenient dumping ground for the undesirable female. The diagnosis as a social weapon. The medical establishment, deeply embedded in the patriarchal structure, provided a ready vocabulary for female nonconformity. A rebellious wife might be certified for moral insanity or undue excitement. A woman who displayed intellectual ambition, demanded a separation, or expressed a lack of sexual feeling could be labeled with hysteria or chronic melancholia, diagnoses so vague they could fit any deviation from the ideal. The husband's veto. Before the late Victorian reforms, and often in spite of them, a husband's authority was nearly absolute. Under the pre-reform laws, a husband needed minimal evidence and often just the signature of a compliant physician to have his wife committed. This was a legal, inexpensive, and socially acceptable way to dispose of a wife who had committed adultery, squandered money, or simply become a source of social embarrassment. The property coup. The asylum gates were closely linked to the Great Transaction. By declaring his wife insane, the husband could often gain complete unchallenged control over her remaining assets, dowry, and inheritance, securing his position while silencing her. The threat of the asylum was thus a powerful deterrent against any independent financial action by the wife. The silence of the victim. Once committed, the woman's credibility vanished. Her protests of sanity were dismissed as delusions of persecution, and any attempt to contact outside authorities was intercepted. The institution of the asylum legally and socially erased the truth of her predicament. The asylum gates were thus not a passage to healing, but a trapdoor to legal and civil death, secured by the husband and stamped by the physician. A woman's 3 paths to commitment. The women locked behind the asylum gates rarely suffered from the extreme psychosis often associated with madness. Instead, they represented those who had failed one of the 3 core purity tests of Victorian womanhood. This category encompassed the true targets of the absolute tyranny of sexual innocence. The woman who failed to be the angel. The adulteress. If a man sought a divorce, the simplest way to avoid scandal and financial penalty was to commit his unfaithful wife. The adultery was recast as a symptom of a diseased moral sense, a form of temporary madness caused by her overwrought nerves or unstable womb. Her punishment for the moral fall was perpetual confinement. The unwed mother or victim. Women who became pregnant out of wedlock or who were victims of sexual assault were often committed by their own families. This was done to hide the scandal, preserve the family name, and prevent the woman from passing on her supposed moral taint. Her commitment was a desperate, final act of family piety. The sexually knowledgeable. Any woman who showed an appetite for passion, questioned her husband's authority, or, worst of all, was thought to be a nymphomaniac, a hysterical diagnosis based on perceived sexual excess, was immediately labeled insane. Her crime was the expression of female desire, which was pathologized as a form of madness. These women were the casualties of the needle and the nightmare, those whose minds refused the boredom of the drawing room and whose spirits broke the mold of submission. The ambitious spinster. An unmarried woman who insisted on pursuing a professional career, demanding higher education, or refusing an advantageous marriage was a threat to social order. Her insistence on autonomy was deemed an unnatural masculine trait, a sign of the mind becoming unhinged by excessive study. She was committed to force her return to the proper passive feminine state. The suffragist activist. Women who participated in public life, particularly those who agitated for property rights or the vote, were often deemed hysterical. Their political passion was interpreted as an unstable emotional state, their public visibility as a sign of their inappropriate loss of shame. The chronic melancholic. The highly intelligent, sensitive woman who suffered from profound existential despair due to her lack of purpose, true depression, was seen as morbid and emotionally volatile. Unlike the woman who performed the tearful ideal, the melancholic woman was often withdrawn and quiet, leading physicians to conclude her introversion was a sign of dangerous mental withdrawal. Puerperal insanity. The dreaded postpartum psychosis, often triggered by physical exhaustion, infection, and hormone collapse, led to the immediate and terrifying diagnosis of puerperal insanity. Since the mother was potentially a danger to her child, immediate removal to the asylum was considered mandatory. Her failure to withstand the demands of her biological destiny was viewed as a profound, irrevocable failure. Menopausal hysteria. As a woman aged and entered menopause, the hormonal changes were often cited as the cause of renewed hysteria or melancholia. Her loss of reproductive function stripped her of her primary social value, and any associated emotional distress was blamed on the instability of her changing body, often leading to a final period of asylum confinement. Inside the gates, the purgatory of the institution. Once behind the asylum gates, the women were subjected to routines and treatments that reinforced their status as failed women, designed to break their will and instill absolute obedience. The loss of identity. The moment of admission was an act of erasure. The woman was stripped of her fashionable clothes, dressed in rough institutional garb, and often forced to adopt a new clinical name. She was no longer a wife, a daughter, or a gentle woman. She was a patient, an inmate, or a case study. Treatments of submission. The asylum's therapies were designed less to cure and more to punish nonconformity. The cold water cure. Prolonged cold baths, often lasting hours, were used to shock the nerves back into line. This was a form of sensory torture designed to break the patient's resistance. Mechanical restraint. Straitjackets, muffs, and padded cells were used to control women deemed violent or uncontrollable, often for nothing more than sustained screaming or acts of defiance against the staff. Enforced solitude. Much like the more controlled rest cure, enforced solitude and isolation were common, removing any possibility of intellectual or emotional stimulation, ensuring a profound psychological dependence. The gendered labor. Even within the asylum, the expectation of female domesticity persisted. Many women were put to work in the asylum's own laundries, kitchens, or sewing rooms, performing the domestic tasks that had often contributed to their nervous exhaustion in the first place, the needle and the nightmare. This unpaid, relentless labor was framed as therapeutic, reinforcing the idea that women's hands should always be busy.
Why the asylum was the final lock. The asylum was the ultimate tool of the Iron Hand, because it was the only institution that could completely sever the woman from her social and economic ties, ensuring her silence forever. The final warning. The existence of the asylums and the very visible destruction of those committed there served as the most terrifying warning to every woman in the drawing room. The choice was clear: conform to the velvet-gloved constraints of the gilded cage, or face the cold iron bars of the asylum gates. The fear of this final punishment enforced compliance far more effectively than any moral sermon. Social amnesia. The family of the committed woman was instructed to behave as if she no longer existed. Her name was dropped from conversation, her room was repurposed, and her position was filled. Society practiced a deliberate social amnesia regarding her existence, protecting the family's reputation while simultaneously completing the woman's erasure. The irreversible label. Even if she were released, a rarity after prolonged confinement, the label of insane was indelible. No respectable person would hire her, and no man would marry her. She remained perpetually fallen in the public mind, ensuring her continued exile on the fringes of society. The asylum gates, therefore, stand as the most powerful monument to Victorian patriarchy, the ultimate tool for turning intellectual, emotional, and social deviance into a controllable, punishable disease. The asylum was the destination where the woman's good name was not merely slandered, but buried alive, and where the promise of the angel was extinguished by the final, terrifying command of the Iron Hand. The ruined. The logic of unequal judgment. The Iron Hand of Victorian society was forged in the hypocritical fires of its moral code. The entire structure of the gilded cage, from the economic imperative of marriage to the ultimate threat of the asylum, was sustained by one crushing injustice: the sexual double standard. This policy created two distinct moral universes, one for men and one for women, which ensured that sexual transgression was treated not as a universal human flaw, but as a gendered crime. For the man, deviance was an expected, often celebrated trait. He was the libertine, whose indiscretions were excused by biology and forgiven by society. For the woman, the same act meant total annihilation. She was the ruined, stripped of her identity and exiled from the social contract. This was the logic of unequal judgment, a devastating obsession that cemented male control and systematically destroyed countless female lives. The foundations of moral asymmetry. The justification for the double standard was built upon a perverse combination of biological theory, religious interpretation, and economic self-interest, all designed to secure male dominance. The biological imperative myth. Victorian medical and sociological dogma held that men were driven by powerful, uncontrollable sexual appetites, a natural biological imperative necessary for the continuation of the species. Female desire, conversely, was either non-existent, the absolute tyranny of sexual innocence, or confined to the passive duty of procreation. This belief framed male promiscuity as a biological necessity and female promiscuity as a monstrous, unnatural act of moral corruption. Economic control. The double standard was essential to upholding the sanctity of the great transaction, marriage. A man needed absolute certainty that the children his wife bore were legitimately his, ensuring the correct transmission of property, titles, and wealth. While a man's adultery was a moral failing, a wife's adultery was an economic and legal fraud, capable of destroying the patriarchal lineage. Therefore, the purity of the woman had to be policed with an obsessive ferocity unmatched by the scrutiny applied to the man. The worldly man versus the angel woman. Society created two parallel moral ideals. The man was expected to be worldly, knowledgeable about business, politics, and human nature, a knowledge that implicitly included the darker side of life. The woman, the angel in the house, had to be sheltered, innocent, and pure. This required a constant, public demonstration of moral sacrifice by the woman, while the man was allowed to indulge his natural needs in the public sphere, while demanding purity in his private sphere. This system was an engine of hypocrisy, celebrating the man who violated the rules while utterly condemning the woman who did the same. The forgiven and the worldly. The man who engaged in premarital relationships, used prostitutes, or kept a mistress was labeled the libertine, a term that carried a sophisticated, almost romantic connotation, not a condemnatory one. Social acceptance and secrecy. The existence of prostitution, a vast social institution in every major Victorian city, proof that male demand was high and socially tolerated. While gentlemen were expected to be discreet, their activities were understood as part of sowing wild oats or satisfying natural urges. The unwritten rule was, don't get caught in a way that creates a public scandal. The public-private divide. A man could maintain a perfect public reputation, be a judge, a church deacon, or a leading industrialist, while regularly engaging in vice. His public role as a provider and a moral leader was generally held separate from his private sexual conduct. His financial success in the public sphere easily overshadowed his moral lapses in the private sphere. The wife's burden. The wife of the libertine was forced into a complex silence. She was expected to ignore his transgressions, maintain the facade of a happy marriage, and uphold the family's reputation at all costs. To publicly challenge her husband's behavior was to risk the destruction of her own reputation, the single slander, and the collapse of the economic security provided by the great transaction. Her silence was a mandated act of sacrifice. The libertine faced inconvenience, perhaps a minor financial debt, but never the total, irreversible social destruction reserved for his female counterpart. His freedom was the direct cause of her enslavement.
The exiled and the annihilated. The woman who failed the purity test, whether through consensual error or as a victim of abuse, became the ruined woman, the ultimate failure of the Victorian ideal. Irreversible status. Unlike the man, the woman's status was permanent. Once purity was lost, it could never be regained. Society did not recognize a continuum of forgiveness. The fall was absolute. She was cast out of the gilded cage entirely, stripped of the velvet shield of respectability. Total social exile. The ruined woman faced social death. She was instantly and universally shunned by respectable society, losing the support of her family, her friends, and all opportunities for a legitimate life. Her existence became a moral contamination that others were compelled to avoid. The loss of all capital. She lost her reputation, or her social capital, her economic prospects, her financial capital, and her domestic standing, her emotional capital. She was forced into the company of other outcasts, often leading to prostitution or the miserable conditions of the Magdalene institutions, as seen in The Asylum Gates. The fate of the child. If she bore an illegitimate child, the child too was branded, facing an upbringing marked by poverty and social stigma. The woman bore the entire lifelong consequences of the act, while the father remained anonymous and free. The moral weight of a shared act was placed entirely on her shoulders, leading to her complete erasure from the world of respectability. The logic of unequal judgment in divorce. Nowhere was the logic of unequal judgment clearer and more devastating than in the law governing marriage and divorce, particularly in the mid-Victorian era. The man's path to divorce. In Britain, under the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, a man could petition for divorce solely on the grounds of his wife's simple adultery. Her sexual purity was the central pillar of the contract. The woman's near impossibility. A woman could not petition for divorce merely because her husband was unfaithful. To obtain a divorce, she had to prove that his adultery was compounded by additional egregious factors, such as incest, bigamy, rape, sodomy, cruelty, or 2 years of desertion. Adultery alone for the libertine was insufficient to break the legal contract. Financial ruin. Even if the woman successfully proved the compounded cruelty and obtained a divorce, the financial outcome was often ruinous. She lost her social standing, was often denied custody of her children, and was financially dependent on the court's often meager settlement from her husband. She had won the moral argument, but lost everything else. The legal system was designed to protect the male property owner's lineage and security, treating female adultery as a capital crime against property, while male adultery was treated as a regrettable moral lapse. The punishment for the accused victim. The double standard extended even to those who were victims of male aggression. The moral obsession with female purity created a climate where the victim was frequently blamed and punished. Rape and the loss of value. If a woman was the victim of rape, she was often seen as damaged goods because her essential asset, her sexual innocence, was compromised. Her future marriage prospects were severely diminished. The victim, not the perpetrator, bore the permanent mark of the crime. The trial as a second assault. In the courtroom, the victim was subjected to intense scrutiny regarding her past conduct, dress, and reputation, as the defense sought to prove her lack of virtue and thus imply consent or complicity. The focus was less on the crime committed against her and more on her failure to adequately protect her own purity. Family reaction. Many families desperate to avoid the single slander often committed the victim to an asylum, the asylum gates, rather than allow the scandal to be publicized, thereby annihilating the victim to preserve the family name. The terror of ruin often surpassed the empathy for the crime. The tyranny was so absolute that a woman was held responsible for the moral conduct of the man who harmed her. the psychological imprint, and the culture of fear. The logic of unequal judgment created a profound, crippling psychological landscape for the Victorian woman. Internalized scrutiny. Women lived in a constant state of fear, knowing that their very existence was perpetually held in a precarious balance. They became obsessive self-censors, monitoring every movement, every word, and every glance for fear of accidental impropriety. This created the chronic anxiety and nerves that doctors conveniently labeled hysteria. Moral isolation. The system compelled women to police each other. Respectable women often had to be the harshest judges of the ruined woman, as their own purity was defined in opposition to the exile. To show mercy to the fallen was to risk contaminating one's own standing, thus making women involuntary agents of the iron hand. The cost of silence. The woman was forced to internalize the full emotional and moral burden of her life, unable to share her true frustrations, fears, or doubts with anyone, including her husband or even her closest friends. The price of her good name was her emotional and intellectual honesty, leading to the profound psychological distress of true depression. The double standard ensured that female emotional life was dominated by a fear of moral collapse, while male emotional life was characterized by a sense of entitled freedom. The breaking of the chain, rebellion, and reform. The sheer injustice of the double standard eventually fueled the fires of social reform. The logic was so indefensible that it became a central focus for the nascent feminist movements in both Britain and America. The campaigns against vice. Reformers began to challenge the hypocrisy directly, arguing that the true shame lay not with the ruined woman, but with the libertine who created her. Campaigns against prostitution and the Contagious Disease Acts, laws that punished prostitutes but not their clients, were fierce attempts to impose the same moral standard on men as on women. The demand for equal divorce laws became a crucial battleground, slowly achieving incremental changes that sought to recognize a wife's moral and emotional suffering as grounds for ending the contract. Ultimately, the logic of unequal judgment began to crumble only when women gained economic independence through the Married Women's Property Acts and access to professions. When a woman could earn her own livelihood, she was no longer forced into the great transaction and no longer feared the total economic ruin that followed the single slander. Her name began to derive value from her actions in the public sphere, not just her innocence in the private sphere. The Victorian era's most destructive obsession was not with appearance or piety, but with control. The logic of unequal judgment was the final devastating tool of the iron hand, ensuring that the libertine enjoyed freedom at the cost of the ruined woman's total annihilation. Beyond the veil, Victorian doctors and the scientific misunderstanding of the female body. The gilded cage was a masterpiece of social engineering, but its true architect was not the moralist or the legislator. It was the doctor. The entire system of constraints, from the enforced frailty of the corset to the asylum's legal lock, was ultimately validated and enforced by the supposedly objective authority of Victorian doctors. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge, and their scientific misunderstanding of the female body was the obsession that lent credibility to every societal chain. The female body, wrapped in modesty and obscured by ignorance, became a landscape of fear, misdiagnosis, and abuse. The reign of the uterus, the womb as the center of all affliction. The central tenet of Victorian medical thought regarding women was the absolute sovereignty of the uterus. Dating back to ancient Greek theories of hysteria, physicians believed that the female body was entirely governed by its reproductive organs.
The unstable organ.
The uterus, ovaries, and associated nerves were considered inherently unstable, prone to congestion, wandering, or collapse under stress. Any symptom a woman presented, a headache, a tremor, anxiety, depression, or intellectual ambition, was immediately traced back to a gynecological source. The male body was governed by the rational brain, the female body by the volatile womb. The biological imperative. Doctors believed that a woman's entire energy and purpose were devoted to reproduction, the womb's vow. They argued that any energy diverted to the brain through education or reading would necessarily steal from the reproductive system, leading to chronic illness, sterility, or nervous collapse. This belief provided the scientific justification for denying women higher education and meaningful work. The misdiagnosed mind. By routing all emotional and mental distress through the uterus, doctors systematically missed the true causes of suffering: social isolation, boredom, suppression of desire, and lack of agency. The problem was not the woman's body, but her position in society. Yet the medical theory preserved the social structure by making the woman herself the flawed subject. This obsession with the uterus created a medical blind spot, ensuring that genuine suffering was never understood as a rational response to oppression. The epidemic of hysteria and the pathologizing of discontent. The scientific misunderstanding peaked with the explosive rise of hysteria, the catch-all diagnosis that served as the ultimate weapon against female nonconformity. Symptoms of suppression. As explored in A Lady's Melancholia, the symptoms of hysteria were diverse: fainting, convulsions, tears, nervousness, paralysis, and insomnia. These were, in fact, the physical manifestations of the constant psychological pressure exerted by the logic of unequal judgment and the needle and the nightmare. The power of the label. The diagnosis of hysteria was essential to the iron hand. It allowed the husband to dismiss his wife's complaints as irrational illness and allowed the family to commit the rebellious daughter to the asylum gates without legal difficulty. The diagnosis served to discredit the woman's voice entirely. The hysterical therapy paradox. The treatments for hysteria were punitive and controlling. They ranged from the barbaric to ovarectomy, or surgical removal of the ovaries, performed in the belief that the source of the madness was in the reproductive organs, to the repressive, the rest cure. These treatments were designed to enforce passive obedience, not to heal a neurological disorder, proving that the medical goal was social control, not scientific cure. The doctor's authority transformed the emotional cry for freedom into a biological abnormality, effectively silencing the most powerful forms of female protest. The peril of the lying-in room. While doctors were preoccupied with the elusive pathology of the womb, they tragically overlooked basic principles of hygiene, leading directly to the horrifying maternal mortality rates detailed in The Womb's Vow. Puerperal fever. The greatest killer of Victorian women during childbirth was puerperal fever, a streptococcal infection. For much of the century, doctors vehemently denied that they themselves were responsible for transmitting the deadly bacteria. They moved directly from performing autopsies in the mortuary to examining laboring women without washing their hands or changing their clothes. In the 1840s, the Hungarian physician Ignat Semmelweis discovered that simply requiring doctors to wash their hands with chlorinated lime solution drastically reduced maternal mortality. His findings, based on clear statistical evidence, were mocked, ridiculed, and ultimately rejected by the dominant male medical establishment, who considered the idea of their gentlemen's hands carrying disease to be an affront to their dignity. This arrogant refusal to acknowledge basic germ theory cost the lives of countless women. The lying-in room was a site of mortal peril, not due to the inherent dangers of birth, but due to the fatal combination of bacterial transmission and the medical arrogance that refused to accept a simple solution offered by a colleague. The scientific misunderstanding was not just theoretical, it was lethally practical, making the very act of seeking medical assistance a deadly risk. Modesty and obscurity. The Victorian obsession with sexual innocence profoundly hampered a doctor's ability to actually examine and understand the female body. Modesty codes created layers of ritual and obscurity that protected the woman's purity but endangered her health. The veil of propriety. Doctors were reluctant to perform thorough physical examinations, particularly pelvic exams, unless absolutely necessary, and often only under anesthetic or through a complex ritual involving a female nurse or chaperone. The fear of scandal was paramount, the single slander. Symptom evasion. Women themselves, raised in a culture that denied their sexuality, were often unable or unwilling to clearly articulate symptoms related to their reproductive or urological health. Their communication was couched in vague terms related to nerves, indisposition, or melancholy. This combination of medical reluctance and female evasion meant that serious physical conditions such as ovarian cysts, uterine tumors, or even early-stage cancers were frequently misdiagnosed as hysteria or nervous exhaustion until they reached a life-threatening stage. The obsession with female purity ensured that her body remained obscured and under-examined, leaving physical diseases to advance unchecked. Breaking the monopoly. The systemic failures and abuses of the male medical monopoly eventually spurred a crucial aspect of the whispers of rebellion, the demand for female physicians. The need for empathy. Women recognized that they needed doctors who understood their bodies without the filter of patriarchal ideology. Doctors who would attribute their suffering to physical causes, not moral or hysterical ones. Pioneering women like Elizabeth Blackwell, the first women to receive a medical degree in the United States in 1849, and Sophia Jacques-Blake, a key figure in opening medical education in the UK, faced incredible hostility, mockery, and resistance. They were accused of being unsexed, immoral, and incapable of the necessary scientific rigor. Their struggle was inherently political, challenging the male monopoly on scientific knowledge. The lady doctor, once established, changed the dynamic in the examination room. She removed the layer of shame and secrecy, allowing women to speak openly about their symptoms. More importantly, she approached female anatomy with a scientific curiosity unburdened by the ideological need to prove the woman's inherent weakness. She treated the woman as a patient, not as a moral symbol. The fight for female medical education was a direct confrontation with the iron hand, challenging the very authority that had validated the gilded cage. The legacy of misunderstanding. The modern echoes. The Victorian doctor, shrouded in respectability and armed with the flawed science of the age, was the ultimate enforcer of the gilded cage. By misinterpreting female physiology, he provided the ultimate justification for the model household. Art, literature, and the documenting of female suppression. The iron hand of Victorian society worked tirelessly to silence female suffering, labeling discontent as hysteria and banishing rebels behind the asylum gates. Yet the immense psychological toll of the gilded cage could not be entirely contained. It erupted in the cultural landscape, finding voice and form not in political pamphlets or medical journals, but in the subversive narratives of art and literature. The obsession with controlling women ultimately created the very mythology of defiance, the madwoman in the attic, the literary archetype of female suppression, madness, and rebellion. This part of the legacy explores how artists and writers, often women themselves, smuggled the truth of female despair past the censors of propriety, documenting female suppression and providing a crucial psychological record of the era's destruction. The literature became the single space where the angel in the house could be openly rejected and the agony of the ruined could be felt. Subverting the angel. The figure of the mad woman in the attic finds its most famous origin in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, 1847. Bronte did what no Victorian moralist dared. She placed the rage, the passion, and the terrifying consequence of marital confinement right at the center of the respectable domestic ideal. Bertha Mason, the embodiment of suppression. Bertha Mason, Mr. Rochester's secret wife, confined to the attic, is not simply insane. She is the symbolic manifestation of everything the respectable Victorian woman, the angel, embodied by Jane, had to repress. She is passion, sexuality, fury, and uncontrollable independence, all the traits denied by the absolute tyranny of sexual innocence. The Wedding and the Truth. Bertha's dramatic appearance to rip Jane's wedding veil is a furious protest against the great transaction, a brutal declaration that marriage, built on lies and legal confinement, will drive a woman mad. Bertha's existence reveals the dark, violent truth hidden above the elegant drawing room. The shared fate. The mad woman in the attic is not a villain, but a tragic double. She represents Jane's potential fate if she were to fully surrender her autonomy to a patriarchal marriage. Bronte used the Gothic horror trope to critique the actual horror of female confinement and the terrifying threat of the asylum gates looming over any rebellious wife. Bronte's work provided a powerful, enduring metaphor that artists and writers would adopt to express the psychological trauma of the age. Visualizing the cult of the invalid. Victorian painting, while often celebrating the virtuous angel, also captured the pervasive sense of female sorrow and the aesthetic of sickness, the cult of the invalid. These paintings became the era's visual record of a lady's melancholia. The fainting woman. Artists frequently depicted women fainting, weeping, or languishing on sofas. These images, while superficially reinforcing the desired image of female fragility, also documented the physical symptoms of emotional collapse, the reality of the restricted breathing from the fatal curve, and the sheer exhaustion of performing the tearful ideal. The Ophelia trope, pre-Raphaelites. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, particularly through works like John Everett Millais' Ophelia, romanticized the female death associated with emotional trauma. Ophelia, floating beautifully toward death after emotional betrayal, became an iconic representation of the ruined woman who was too pure and fragile to survive the harsh world of male vice, him the libertine. This art, while beautiful, masked the uglier reality of female suicide and desperation with an aesthetic of tragedy. The confined gaze. Portraits often showed women with a distant, melancholic gaze, looking out from a window or a heavily furnished room. This confined gaze visually documented the intellectual starvation and profound boredom of the drawing room, the needle and the nightmare, capturing the psychological toll of enclosure better than any medical report. Art thus worked in a dual capacity. It both aestheticized the suffering for public consumption and provided a coded visual record of the despair. The literature as the moral battleground. The Victorian novel, the dominant popular art form, became the primary battleground for debating and documenting the destructive power of the sexual double standard. The fate of the fallen. Novelists like Elizabeth Gaskell, Ruth, and Thomas Hardy, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, used fiction to argue for moral empathy over moral dogma. Gaskell's Ruth told the story of an unmarried mother who is kind, moral, and ultimately driven to death by society's unforgiving hypocrisy. Hardy's Tess showed a woman destroyed by the injustice of a moral code that prized male chastity over female compassion. These novels forced the reader to confront the illogical cruelty of punishing the ruined woman. The problem of the unmarried woman. Writers like George Eliot, Marianne Evans, challenged the absolute necessity of the great transaction. Her heroines often struggled with the limitations placed on unmarried intellectual women, choosing a life of personal development and difficult work over the empty security of a loveless marriage, thereby documenting the immense courage required to defy the obsession with marriage. The critique of domesticity. Writers like the American Kate Chopin, The Awakening, later pushed the boundaries further, documenting the sheer suffocating emptiness of domesticity. Chopin's Edna Pontellier, stifled by the womb's vow and the role of the wife-mother, seeks personal and sexual freedom, only to be crushed by the society that cannot tolerate her desire for self-ownership. Literature allowed women to articulate their pain in a way that was both emotionally powerful and socially palatable, passing the message of rebellion under the guise of entertainment. Charlotte Perkins Gilman and The Wall. The most direct and brutal literary indictment of the medical and social constraints came from the American author Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Her short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, 1892, is the defining document of the psychological destruction of the era, a direct assault on the rest cure. Gilman's story is a thinly veiled autobiographical critique of the very treatments used to enforce female passivity, a lady's melancholia. The narrator is forbidden to write, the only outlet for her intellectual life, and ordered to rest. The metaphor of the paper, the hideous, confusing yellow wallpaper in her confinement room, is the central metaphor. It represents the irrational, oppressive, and utterly illogical structure of Victorian patriarchy. The woman who sees herself trapped behind the pattern of the paper is the final realization of the mad woman in the attic archetype. The triumph of madness. The story concludes with the narrator descending into psychosis, creeping over the body of her male physician husband who has fainted from shock. This ending is not merely tragic, it is a declaration of victory through madness. The woman finds liberation in insanity, rejecting the social role that was designed to break her mind. Gilman's work exposed the medical obsession as a form of deliberate psychological torture. The literature provided the vocabulary for the whispers of rebellion, turning the private suffering into a public, shared grievance. Legacy, the power of documenting suppression. The art and literature of the Victorian era, particularly the subversive works that focused on the themes of hysteria, adultery, and domestic despair, were critical to the eventual unraveling and legacy of the Gilded Cage. Providing validation. For generations of women trapped in the confines of the drawing room, these narratives provided crucial validation. They proved that the deep feeling of isolation, the sense of unreality, and the profound boredom were not personal moral failings, but a shared condition. Fueling reform. The powerful imagery of the fallen woman and the mad woman in the attic became rallying cries for the early suffragettes. The reformers used these artistic representations of destruction to argue that the political and legal system was literally
driving women to suicide and madness, providing emotional urgency to their demands for the vote and property rights. Shaping modern feminism. The archetype of the mad woman in the attic remains one of the most enduring symbols of female repression in Western literature, shaping the core analysis of feminist literary theory for the next century. It is the ultimate cultural proof that the price of enforced sexual innocence was the woman's sanity. The aesthetic of the mad woman in the attic was the most profound artistic statement of the age. When society systematically attempts to destroy a woman's life by denying her intellect, agency, and selfhood, the only available form of integrity may be the ultimate, furious rejection of sanity itself. Immigration and the hope of escape from British class obsessions. The suffocating reality of the gilded cage was most intensely felt by those women trapped in the rigid social strata of Victorian Britain. The chains of domesticity, morality, and the double standard were made heavier by the unyielding strictures of British class obsessions. The ultimate, often desperate hope for escape from this rigid hierarchy lay not in revolution at home, whispers of rebellion, but in a radical act of self-exile, immigration to the West. The dream of America, the New World dreams, represented a chance to shed the burdensome identity of the constrained Victorian lady and forge a new life unburdened by the relentless pressure of social standing, purity, and the fate of the spinster. This chapter explores how the promise of democratic equality and economic opportunity across the Atlantic offered a profound counter-narrative to the destruction wrought by British class constraints, becoming a desperate pilgrimage for women seeking autonomy and respect. The tyranny of the British class system. In Britain, a woman's fate was fixed at birth by her class. The constraints of the iron hand were applied differently but equally ruthlessly across the social spectrum. The upper class cage. For aristocratic women, the pressure was immense but aesthetic. They were the visible symbols of family lineage and status. Their lives were dictated by strict etiquette, the necessary production of heirs, the womb's vow, and the management of enormous impersonal households. Their suffering was private, often leading to hysteria or reliance on laudanum, but their economic safety was relatively secure. The middle-class prison. The middle-class woman endured the most intense pressure of the gilded cage. She was the primary subject of all the obsessions, the tight lacing, the constant need to prove purity, and the endless, mind-numbing labor of the drawing room. Her great fear was a fall in class, losing her husband's money, becoming a spinster, or failing to secure the great transaction. The working-class treadmill. For the working-class woman, there was no velvet glove, only a raw, grinding treadmill. While she had more economic freedom, she was allowed to work. Her life was characterized by long hours, brutal wages, dangerous factory conditions, and the high risk of mortality during childbirth. Her despair was economic, her body physically broken by toil, unlike the nervous collapse of her wealthier counterpart. The pervasive, unforgiving nature of this rigid class structure meant that upward mobility was a near impossibility. The only way to truly change one's class identity was to leave the country that enforced it. Equality and opportunity. The United States and the developing Commonwealth nations, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, offered an ideological and tangible contrast to the rigid conservatism of Britain. This was the promise that fueled the New World dreams. The myth of democratic equality. America was championed in popular accounts as a land where birthright was irrelevant and effort was rewarded. This was a profound antidote to the fixed status of the British system. For a woman, the idea of a society where her husband's family name mattered less than his earning potential, and where her character mattered more than her grandfather's title, was revolutionary. Economic opportunity, the real escape. The greatest lure was economic.
The New World offered available land, rapid industrial expansion, and, critically for women, a scarcity of female labor outside of the home. This scarcity meant that jobs like teaching, nursing, and even factory work were more abundant and paid better than in Britain. For a middle-class spinster facing the prospect of becoming an unpaid governess, the chance to earn an independent, respectable wage in America was irresistible. A new moral slate. Immigration offered a chance for personal reinvention. The woman who had been damaged by the single slander or the unforgiving judgment of her community could simply disappear. In the vastness of America, her past indiscretions or the shame of her family's poverty could be left behind. The New World offered a clean slate, a necessary escape from the absolute tyranny of sexual innocence. Organized escape. The movement of women across the Atlantic was often formalized through organized emigration schemes, driven by both philanthropic and economic motives. Charitable aid. Various organizations, often run by progressive women, raised money to assist distressed gentlewomen, impoverished middle-class spinsters, widows, or women suffering from true depression due to boredom, to find opportunities in the colonies. The goal was to provide a means of earning an independent living, rescuing them from the fate of becoming a burden to their family. The domestic servant trade. Most immigration programs focused on single, working-class women to fill the desperate demand for domestic servants and agricultural workers in rapidly expanding towns. While this was still servitude, the wages and conditions were often perceived as superior to the workhouse or factory floors of industrial Britain. The psychological decision. The decision to immigrate was often an act of immense courage. It meant severing all familial and social ties and facing an unknown future. For a woman raised to believe she was fragile and incapable, the voyage itself, the terrifying Atlantic crossing, was the first powerful act of physical defiance, a rejection of the cult of the invalid.
The enduring chains. The New World dreams were not always met with the promised reality. While the chains of British class were often broken, new forms of constraint quickly emerged. Hardship and isolation. Life on the American frontier or in the developing Canadian West was brutal. Women faced extreme physical hardship, relentless domestic labor, without the benefit of the British class structure. They became their own servants. And profound cultural isolation. The womb's vow often continued unabated, but now without the aid of a large family network. New forms of class. While titles and lineage mattered less, economic class quickly reasserted itself in the New World. Success was tied to hard work, land ownership, and entrepreneurial spirit, a male domain. Women, while often earning wages, remained structurally disadvantaged in terms of property ownership and political power. The American double standard. The logic of unequal judgment did not vanish at Ellis Island. The American moral code regarding female purity was often just as strict, particularly in smaller, close-knit communities. The fallen woman still faced social exile, though perhaps her path to economic recovery was slightly less restricted. However, the key difference lay in the potential for change. Unlike the fixed, suffocating rigidity of Britain, the New World offered fluidity. A woman could work, save, and purchase property, especially after the implementation of the Married Women's Property Acts. Her future was determined by her actions, not her ancestry. Female autonomy. The wave of female immigration was a massive, decentralized, and often silent act of rebellion against the British class obsessions. The women who crossed the Atlantic fundamentally changed the character of the emerging nations and accelerated the decline of Victorian constraints. Empowerment through necessity. The harsh necessity of life in the New World
forced women into roles of power and competence. They became co-managers of farms, nurses in remote settlements, and entrepreneurs in bustling towns. They learned independence not through theory, but through survival. This newfound competency directly contradicted the medical theories of the Victorian doctors, who had defined them as inherently fragile. Fueling the American suffrage movement. The pioneer states of the American West, such as Wyoming and Utah, were the first to grant women the right to vote. This was partly due to the pioneer spirit of equality, but also due to the sheer necessity of acknowledging the enormous contribution of women to settlement. The independent, land-owning, voting woman of the American West stood in contrast to the constrained, disenfranchised woman of London. This empowered figure became a powerful symbol for the early suffragettes back home. A new female identity. The immigrant woman ultimately forged a new female identity, one defined by resilience, pragmatism, and self-reliance, rather than fragility, passivity, and obedience. She replaced the emotional labor of the tearful ideal with the physical labor of building a life. The New World did not remove all chains, but it gave women the hammer to break them themselves. How Victorian ideals persist today. The gilded cage of Victorian England was dismantled by the relentless efforts of the early suffragettes and the inevitable march of the 20th century. The corset has been relegated to costume. The lying-in room is modernized, and the Married Women's Property Acts have long ensured legal autonomy. Yet, to assume the Victorian age of female destruction is merely a historical footnote is a dangerous oversight. The iron hand did not vanish. It simply traded its velvet glove for a more subtle, digitized disguise. The echoes of the gilded cage resonate powerfully in modern society, proving that the obsessions that destroyed women's lives, purity, fragility, mandatory domesticity, and aesthetic suffering, have merely evolved into contemporary pressures. This concluding chapter serves as a stark analysis of how Victorian ideals persist today, showing that the fight for female selfhood is a continuous battle against patterns of control rooted in the 19th century mind. The persistence of appearance, from corset to cosmetic surgery. The Victorian obsession with appearance and purity has transformed into a global, multi-billion-dollar industry focused on the relentless perfection of the female form. The modern fatal curve. The steel-boned corset is gone, but the fatal curve remains a pervasive aesthetic demand. Today's pressure is internalized, enforced by fitness culture and the beauty industry. The obsession with the perfect body, thin but muscular, youthful but mature, requires women to engage in constant, exhausting physical labor, extreme dieting, relentless exercise that mirrors the perpetual bodily management required by the tight lacer. The goal is the same: to sculpt the body into an ideal that is aesthetically pleasing to the external gaze, often compromising health and natural function, as women today channel vast amounts of time and money into their appearance, just as the Victorian woman did with her poisonous complexion rituals. The arsenic glow reborn. The use of lead and arsenic has been replaced by the normalized consumption of drugs, fillers, and surgical procedures, plastic surgery, Botox, invasive dieting that seek to halt or reverse the natural aging process. The underlying logic is identical: beauty at any cost. Women are still encouraged to subject their bodies to pain and chemicals, often with unknown long-term effects, to maintain the aesthetic of perpetual youth and artificial flawlessness, channeling vast amounts of time and money into their appearance, just as the Victorian woman did with her poisonous complexion rituals. The cult of the sick selfie. The cult of the invalid has been repackaged as the aesthetic of vulnerability on social media. The sick selfie, the trend of glamorizing mental health struggles, or the aestheticization of fragility and emotional transparency, continues to reward women for displaying palatable, delicate suffering, echoing the Victorian idea that a woman's sensitivity and frailty are inherently feminine virtues. The digital double standard, reputation in the Internet age. The absolute tyranny of sexual innocence and the terrifying power of the single slander have been amplified and digitized, making reputation more precarious than ever before. Him, the Libertine Digital Edition. The sexual double standard remains robust. Male partying and sexual exploits are often seen as youthful rites of passage or signs of masculine confidence. Their professional reputations, much like the Victorian libertines, often survive or even thrive despite private misdeeds. Her, the ruined, viral edition. For women, the loss of purity is instant and often irrevocable. One mistake, a private photo, or an unwarranted accusation can go viral, leading to relentless public shaming, doxing, and online harassment. This digital exile mirrors the total social annihilation experienced by the ruined woman, often leading to job loss, withdrawal, and severe mental health crises. The judgment is quicker, more pervasive, and its effects are permanent, making the fear of the single slander a constant in modern life. The Purity Police. The purity test is now conducted by anonymous online mobs who enforce rigid, unforgiving moral standards. Women are judged not just by their actions, but by their friends, their clothing, and their opinions, reinforcing the idea that a woman's value is based on her constant, visible performance of virtue, a direct echo of the Victorian obsession with propriety.
The new chains of domesticity and emotional labor. The shift from the physical constraints of the home to the emotional constraints of modern life shows how the emotional chains have simply become less visible. The unending mend of perfection, the needle and the nightmare, the ceaseless unpaid domestic labor, has been replaced by the pressure of the superwoman myth. Modern women, even those with full-time careers, are expected to perform the lion's share of domestic labor, childcare, and, most crushingly, emotional labor. The constant monitoring and management of the family's psychological and social well-being. This unpaid, invisible work is the modern successor to the boredom of the drawing room, leading to burnout, anxiety, and the modern forms of neurasthenia. The Great Transaction Reimagined. While the law no longer strips a woman of her assets, the economic reality of marriage remains precarious. Women still face the motherhood penalty, reduced wages and career trajectory after having children, and are often primary caregivers, leading to dependence on the male earner and reflecting the risks of the original Great Transaction. The pressure to secure a financially stable partner remains intense, particularly in high-cost societies. The tyranny of the separate sphere. Even with women integrated into the workplace, the ideology of separate spheres lingers. Women are often judged by the perceived cleanliness of their home, the quality of their children's education, and their ability to successfully blend domestic perfection with professional ambition. The burden of having it all is the modern iron hand, requiring women to excel in the public sphere while maintaining the illusion of the flawless angel in the house in the private sphere. The persistence of medical misunderstanding and systemic doubt. The legacy of the Victorian doctors and their scientific misunderstanding continues in the systemic dismissal of women's pain and mental health struggles. Dismissal of female pain. Studies consistently show that women's reports of pain and physical symptoms are often taken less seriously, diagnosed later, and more frequently attributed to psychological or emotional causes than the same symptoms in men. The ghost of hysteria, the medical dismissal of female suffering as nerves or psychosomatic, is still very much alive in modern clinics, leading to long delays in diagnosing conditions like endometriosis or autoimmune diseases. Pathologizing frustration. The mental health epidemic among young women is often rooted in the same forces that created true depression in the Victorian era: social isolation, lack of agency, and performance anxiety. While modern therapy is available, the underlying causes, the pressure to be perfect, the fear of the single slander, and the exhaustion of emotional labor, are sociological, not just chemical, echoing the structural problem that Mitchell's rest cure failed to address. Control over the body. The fight for reproductive autonomy is a modern echo of the tyranny imposed by the womb's vow. Political and legal battles over contraception, abortion access, and mandatory counseling are modern attempts to enforce a state or morally mandated control over a woman's reproductive destiny, recalling the Victorian belief that a woman's body is a resource for society, not her own property. The enduring legacy. From whispers to a shout. The fight against the echoes of the gilded cage requires recognizing that the current struggles for gender equality are not new. They are the continuation of the whispers of rebellion started over a century ago. The greatest legacy of the Victorian era is the understanding that social and political structures are the primary architects of female destruction, not biology. The early suffragettes taught women to organize, to demand equal legal and economic footing, and to reject the idea that their suffering is personal or deserved. The modern woman, equipped with education, voting rights, and legal autonomy, the very tools the Victorian woman was denied, is now engaged in the painstaking work of deconstructing the internalized echoes of the gilded cage. This involves challenging the digital double standard, refusing the superwoman myth, and demanding that her pain, her ambition, and her selfhood be recognized as real, valid, and worthy of protection. The chains may be invisible, but the fight to be truly free is as vital today as it was when the first woman chose to loosen her corset and speak her truth. The final destruction of the Victorian obsessions will only come when women are universally valued not for their purity, their appearance, or their domestic service, but for their simple, unconstrained humanity. Honoring the women who survived the obsessions. The history of the gilded cage is, by necessity, a chronicle of destruction, of shattered bodies, silenced minds, and lives annihilated by the iron hand of obsession. Yet this history would be incomplete and ultimately dishonest if it failed to acknowledge the central, enduring truth. The Victorian era did not produce generations of helpless victims. It forged a lineage of unbreakable spirits. Women who navigated the perils of the corset, the shame of the double standard, and the threat of the asylum not just with compliance, but with cunning, defiance, and resilience. Their legacy is the very foundation of modern female autonomy. The quiet resistance, subverting the chains from within. Survival for the majority of women did not mean storming Parliament or publishing radical tracts. It meant ingenious, daily acts of subtle resistance that subverted the rules of the gilded cage without breaking the contract of respectability. The unlaced body. While fashion magazines preached the fatal curve, countless women, particularly those in the private reality of their homes or dealing with the demands of perpetual pregnancy, chose comfort over conformity. They loosened the laces of their corsets in the privacy of the lying-in room, or wore the less rigid models designed for daily domestic work. This quiet, physical refusal to perform the aesthetics of pain was a personal declaration of bodily sovereignty, a silent rejection of the cult of the invalid. The power of the purse. The fight for economic autonomy was often won through domestic stealth. Before the Married Women's Property Acts legalized their earnings, resourceful wives found ways to hoard money, hide inherited assets, or run small businesses such as renting rooms or selling needlework under their own name, defying the great transaction. This accumulation of secret capital provided a vital escape fund, an insurance policy against the moral collapse threatened by the single slander. The Code of Female Solidarity. Women used the social rituals of the drawing room and the calls of benevolence to build crucial networks of solidarity. They became silent protectors of each other, providing economic aid to the spinster, protecting the reputations of the vulnerable, and helping to conceal the shame of the fallen woman. They formed a clandestine system of support that operated beneath the official male morality, rejecting the pressure to be moral police and choosing empathy instead.
The fight for the mind. For women suffering from the profound boredom of the drawing room and the threat of a lady's melancholia, survival lay in a ferocious, hidden dedication to intellectual life. The secret scholars. Despite being warned by Victorian doctors that education would damage their wombs, countless women secretly devoured books, taught themselves languages, and exchanged intellectual letters. They used the quiet of the drawing room, supposedly dedicated to the needle and the nightmare, as a cover for serious study. They maintained their mental acuity in defiance of the system designed to starve their minds. The pen as a weapon. Women who were prevented from entering public life often funneled their immense talent and frustration into writing. They wrote under pseudonyms, like George Eliot, or they wrote light fiction and poetry that still contained subversive messages about female discontent. They transformed their private, stifled lives into art, effectively documenting female suppression for the generations that followed. Founding the schools. The pioneering women who risked the asylum gates to found women's colleges and professional training schools were true revolutionaries. They recognized that the most crucial tool for breaking the chains was the key to knowledge. Their enduring legacy is the creation of physical and intellectual spaces where women could define their self-worth outside of their marital or reproductive status. These intellectual survivors turned their confinement into a forge, using their minds to generate the blueprints for the future liberation of women. Reclaiming identity. The most difficult path to survival belonged to the ruined woman, the one who, by society's decree, had forfeited her right to existence. Their resilience lay in their ability to survive the unforgiving exile. The redemption in work. Many women exiled from respectable society found unexpected strength and autonomy in the necessity of working. Forced to earn their own money, they gained financial independence, a freedom denied to the respectable wife caught in the great transaction. They traded social standing for real agency. Finding sisterhood. In the Magdalen laundries, the factory floors, and the small communities of exiles, the fallen woman often found a powerful sisterhood. Having been stripped of the need to perform the lie of the tearful ideal, they found genuine emotional connection and support among those who understood the ultimate hypocrisy of the logic of unequal judgment. They recognized that their ruin was a failure of the system, not a flaw in their character. The mothers of the New World. Many survivors of the fall used New World dreams as their final chance. They emigrated to the American West, where anonymity and the need for manpower outweighed past scandal. There, they built lives rooted in competence and economic self-reliance, giving their children a future unburdened by the British obsession with rigid class and moral hypocrisy. Their survival demonstrated the true moral strength lay not in enforced purity, but in the capacity to endure and rebuild after being deliberately annihilated by society. The tools of unraveling. The unbreakable spirits of the Victorian era did not just survive, but they created the tools and the moral foundation necessary for the unraveling and legacy of the 20th century. 1. The legal blueprint. The relentless lobbying and sacrifice of the early suffragettes provided the legal mechanism, the MWPA, and the fight for the vote that finally cracked coverture and ended the political disenfranchisement of women. 2. The medical revolution. The suffering exposed in Beyond the Veil spurred the revolution of female physicians and the demand for unbiased, hygienic medical care, challenging the male monopoly on the female body. 3. The emotional validation. The honest documenting of female suppression in art and literature provided the emotional vocabulary for future generations, validating the psychological truth that boredom and lack of purpose are genuine forms of destruction. 4. The economic imperative. The success of the spinster and the immigrant woman in securing independent livelihoods proved that economic autonomy was the absolute prerequisite for any form of freedom. They broke the fear of poverty that had forced women into the great transaction. The story of the Gilded Cage is ultimately a story of resilience. The women who survived, whether by quiet defiance, intellectual ambition, or sheer endurance, ensured that the cost of female suppression became too visible, too high, and too politically untenable to maintain. They passed down not just the memory of the chains, but the unbreakable spirit required to shatter the echoes of the gilded cage that persist today. Their legacy is the fierce, unwavering insistence on self-ownership, autonomy, and the right to define a woman's life by her own purpose, not by the obsessions of the men who sought to control her.